said, well, how do you create a problem that's real bad? You send in agitators, agent provocateurs, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job is to go into a country, observe all the groups, and pit them against each other. Obama is the one that took these CIA psychological tools and turned them inward on the American population for political purposes. The U.S. under Ronald Reagan arming and training Saddam Hussein and Iraqis to fight the Iranians. And so Saddam was our friend until George H.W. Bush said, no, he's the bad guy, and we switched. And then you had Reagan arming and training the Taliban, but one of the Taliban that was trained by the U.S. was Osama bin Laden. And so if a kid comes out as trans, the teacher celebrates them. And the other kids see that. They see the attention. And then if another kid holds the old-fashioned values, they're like shamed and ridiculed and you're mean. So they call it the pyramid of oppression. Well, the way it works is they do something. It's like that triangle of Hagel. They push, and then they know at some point people are not going to go anymore. And then they come up and say, well, we'll just settle for half as bad. And it's like, oh, man, so I'm relieved. It's not. But then they wait and do another cycle of it. They just need a few more crises to get people to surrender more of their freedom.
Just 30 seconds before we start. In order to understand what is going on right now in the world with Israel-Iran war and other wars and proxies, you have to watch this video from the very beginning till the very end. And I promise you, you won't be disappointed. Bill Federer is a historian and he's a true stud, so he knows what he is saying. Now, in regards to my channel, I don't have any sponsors. So the best thing for you to support me is just to like this video, share it with all your friends, peers, and loved ones, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment below right now. And now, without any further ado, let's get back to the podcast with William Federer. William Federer is a respected American historian, author, and speaker known for his deep exploration of faith, politics, and America's Christian heritage. He has written numerous books, including America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations, and is a frequent guest on radio and television. Federer specializes in connecting historical events with biblical principles, emphasizing the role of Christianity in the founding and development of the United States of America. He also hosts the daily program The American Minute, offering concise insights into pivotal moments in history. His work appeals to the audience interested in faith-based perspectives on American history and culture. William is a man of God. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Apollo.
So, William, obviously we have a lot to talk about and to cover since we're here in California, in LA, but it's a safe neighborhood since it's the Valley. But in downtown, even today, there are a lot of protests and everything that is going on. It reminds me of some kind of a movie. And I want to say those photos that I saw was from Friday. So the protesters were waving the communist flags, the USSR. And since I'm from USSR, I know what it's like to maybe not to live in the communist country, since I was born in '88 and USSR collapsed in '91, right? But I still can see and feel from my parents, neighbors, and the whole mentality of that communist regime. So what is going on in America now? The socialists, the communists, because the whole idea that 150 years ago, one man from Germany, right, Karl Marx, invented had this kind of an idea for a social governance. It spread out that wide, and we still can feel it in America in 2025.
Yeah, so I wrote a book. It's called Socialism, The Real History from Plato to the Present. So prior to Karl Marx, you had Plato around 300 or so BC, and he is the first one that talked about everybody owning everything in common.
Oh, really?
And so in Athens, they did not have a king. It was a democracy, but he writes about this, and he refers back to Atlantis. So Atlantis was this legendary city that would have existed about 800 years before Plato. But Atlantis had the reputation of being a very structured society. Everything was ordered, the streets, the buildings, everything. And it was an island, and it sank in a volcanic eruption. There is an island in the Mediterranean called Santorini, and it's what's left of a volcano. So it's this half-circle rim, and when it exploded, it would have sent a tsunami across the entire Mediterranean, wiping out stuff. There are some that think maybe that was the same time that Moses was leaving Egypt, and the soot went up into the air, and that one of the plagues was hail that was on fire. Well, that would have been the lava rocks coming down. And then it was 3 days of darkness. Well, that could have been the soot. It said it was darkness that you could feel. It would have been the ash. Who knows? But that's some speculation. But nevertheless, Plato several times referred to Atlantis as the perfect structured society. And he considered democracy an unstructured society. And he says that everybody's got their different views on everything, and it's really sort of chaotic. And he said that democracy works as long as the people have virtue, but they didn't have a God of the Bible to be virtuous to. I mean, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, with temple prostitutes. I mean, so it was just being virtuous for the virtuous' sake. And Plato said, you know, people really aren't virtuous. If you give them a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. So nobody, and he even goes so far as to say, if someone was born that truly had virtue, the world would crucify him. Plato said this in 3 centuries before Christ. Anyway, he says that what's going to happen is people are going to yield to their passions, yield to their lusts. It's going to turn into chaos. And out of that chaos, they're going to cry for somebody to restore order. And this person is the philosopher king. And he's a nice dictator. And he's going to bring structure back out of the chaos that was left over from democracy. And Plato says that he will take the children away from the family, bring them into the city of Athens, and indoctrinate them with noble lies. He calls them lies, but they're necessary to keep the dictator in power, and the dictator's keeping it from turning into a democracy, which will end in chaos. And if you give him the benefit of the doubt and say, okay, maybe there is such a thing as a nice dictator, he doesn't live forever, and at some point he's going to turn all that power over to some son who's a bad guy, and he's going to use it oppressively. Mm-hmm. And you even have the story of David, the best king ever. But his oldest son, Amnon, rapes a daughter, Tamar, is murdered by the son Absalom, who tries to overthrow David. Another son, Adonijah, tries to overthrow David. Solomon's good for a while until he marries 1,000 wives and builds pagan temples. It's like, this is the best king ever, David, but then his sons go off track. And so Plato says, okay, you got this philosopher king, but he doesn't realize that even if you got a good guy, what's going to come after him is going to be terrible. Mm-hmm. But he's the one that came up with the idea that this philosopher king is the ruling class, and he's going to take all the property away from everybody, and he's going to dispense it as needed. And he says that there won't be any families because he'll take the children away from the parents and raise them. He says that everybody will own everything in common, but it's the ruling class dictator that gets to decide who gets what. And it's total control. But that seed that Plato planted based on his remembering the legend of Atlantis resurfaces in the 1500s with Sir Thomas More in England, and he writes Utopia, mm-hmm. the island of Utopia. And it's basically Atlantis. So this is shortly after Columbus discovers the New World.
1492.
And so this is a fictitious island that's discovered off the coast of South America. And on this island, everything is structured. There's the ruling class. They control everything. Everybody's got jobs, and the ruling class decides who gets what, and everything's owned in common. And the word utopia means nowhere. And the story is a conversation called the dialogue, with a traveler named Hythlodeus, which means peddler of nonsense. And they think Sir Thomas More wrote this as a veiled criticism of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was Catholic, then he became Protestant, and he made everybody switch, and if they didn't, he killed them.
Because he wanted a divorce, and the Vatican didn't give him a divorce, right?
Correct.
This is the guy. Okay.
Yeah. And so Sir Thomas More was Catholic, and he did not want to switch and become Anglican, and Henry VIII had him killed. So they think he wrote this utopia to say, okay, this structured society is nowhere. It's told to us by a peddler of nonsense. And he sort of takes it to an extreme. So you can read there's a sarcastic mocking of this controlled society. But then after him, you have Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon writes a book called The New Atlantis. He names it the New Atlantis because he's referring back to Plato's Atlantis. Mm-hmm. And this is a fictitious island in the Pacific. Now, Francis Bacon is the one who started the scientific revolution. And so on his island, the ruling class tells people what to do, but they're more scientific careers. But it's all controlled society. Everything is quote unquote owned in common, but it's the ruling class that decides who gets what.
And what century is that?
1626.
Okay.
And so you've got Plato, you got this island of utopia, you've got this New Atlantis by Francis Bacon, and then you have the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were a religious group that left England, came to America. They were going to go to Virginia. They get blown off course, land in Massachusetts. They set up a covenant form of government. But before they did that, they're a company colony. The Pilgrims had no money. So they had to go to investors in England called the Virginia Company or the London Company. And the investors wrote the bylaws for the Pilgrim colony that they used for 7 years. And the bylaws were written based on Sir Thomas More's Utopia and Plato's Atlantis. And
what kind of bylaws, for instance? A few.
So the bylaws for the Pilgrims, written by these investors, said everything gained by hunting, fishing, trading shall go into ye common stock, right? The common warehouse. And everyone's livelihood shall be taken out of ye common stock, right?
So that was basically an experiment, or that was just a joke?
It was an experiment. So Plato, Sir Thomas More, Francis Bacon, they were all theoretical. Mm-hmm. The Pilgrims actually tried it, and they almost starved to death. And William Bradford, the governor of the Pilgrims, it says, this communistic plan of life, he called it a communistic plan of life because everything was owned in common. He says, was tried by good and honest men, but it didn't work. He says, this proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato, espoused by some scholars of latter times, that the owning of everything in common would somehow make men happy as if they were wiser than God.
Why do you think they failed? They didn't manage to create a structure where these are hunters, these are gatherers, these are responsible for, let's say, for domestic stuff, for security, for something else?
No, so William Bradford writes, the young man who was fit for service objected to being paid the same as the old guy who couldn't do half the work. The old guy objected to being classed in labor with the younger and humbler ones and considered it an indignity and disrespect. And the women objected to having to wash other men's clothes. And some husbands would not brook it or allow it.
And how big of a community that was?
120.
120 people only?
Yeah. And then the next year they had maybe another 100 come. So we're just talking a couple hundred. And they tried following these bylaws. Everything's owned in common. And then you had some of them, the husband dies, and the lady's got 6 kids. I don't have time to go out and plant. So William Bradford said, after much discussion, it was decided that every family should get their own plot of land. This made all hands more industrious. He says the women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn,
Because it's
while
theirs.
before they would have alleged weakness and inability, and to have forced them would have been considered great oppression.
Who would have thought that private property does
Yeah.
the miracle, right?
So you had Plato, Sir Thomas More's Utopia, Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. It's all theoretical. The Pilgrims actually tried to live it. They almost die and starved to death. They said, scrap that, give everybody their own plot of land. Everybody's out there working day and night. And then they had an abundance. And then they could share with the people in need voluntarily, rather than the government taking away their stuff and distributing it. And so this concept is biblical. When the children of Israel went into the promised land, every family was given property.
Correct.
If you own property, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. And you can be moved upon to have compassion and voluntarily give away some of your stuff. That's called charity.
Correct.
It's interesting, Karl Marx said the theory of communism may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. Well, if you don't own anything, how can you be charitable? How can you give away what you don't have? What, are you going to steal from somebody, break the law, now you're a thief? No, God entrusts you with stuff and then gives you opportunities to show on the outside the love of God that is on the inside. And so in the Bible, God gives commands to 5 groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. The commands to the individual include taking care of the poor, right? Good Samaritan, you find somebody on the side of the road, you take them to an inn, right? The family commands are mostly relational. Husbands, love your wives. Children, submit to your parents. The business commands are do an honest day's work and don't hold back wages. The church is commanded to take care of the poor. And they immediately did, taking care of the orphans and the widows and feeding, the Greeks and the Hebrew. And throughout the centuries, the church invented hospitals to take care of the poor. The church had orphanages. The church had started schools. The church did all that. There's no command for the government to take care of the poor. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. There's no command for the government to be involved in healthcare. The command to the government is the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. And in America, it happened during the Great Depression. And Herbert Hoover wanted to get the churches and the volunteer organizations, and Franklin Roosevelt said, no, let's have the government come in.
We know better.
And then the government, when it's involved in anything, it's run by politicians who want to stay in office, and they will funnel more stuff to those who vote for them, and they'll take away stuff from those who don't support them, and it becomes discretionary. And the saying is, he who holds the purse strings has the power. So, everybody own everything in common. It's like, yeah, sounds good, but somebody has to be in the government handing out the common stuff. And they're always going to be tempted to want to funnel a little extra to their family and friends and hold back from somebody they don't like, right? And it gets discretionary. And it turns into a deep state bureaucracy passing out favors to their friends. So you have the Communist Party members, and they're the ones distributing the stuff, and they want to, they live in the nice neighborhoods, and they get the nice shopping spots, and everybody else doesn't. George Orwell, I think, if that's the right person I'm thinking of, he wrote Animal Farm.
Correct.
And it's, they kill the farmer, and all the animals are equal except the pigs decide that they're smarter, and so
More
they
equal.
yeah, they're more equal, and they say, well, we're the ones that are keeping everything in order. And so, we get to eat more. We're the head, and we get to eat more, and we get to, and so every attempt at everybody owning everything equally always ends up with a deep state bureaucracy passing out favors to their friends with the most corrupt guy at the top, a dictator. Every time it happens that way, and
Before that, I would like to get a little bit back to ancient Greece. So they 300 BC, Plato, right? So Jesus obviously didn't live in that period of time, but they had their pantheon of gods, right? Where did they come up with this pantheon of gods?
it's your Zeus and Hera and Mercury. I mean, all these. It's basic paganism. India has 300 million different gods. Canaan had Baal and Ashtaroth, and they would worship the gods by giving into the passions. So they would go and have sex with the temple prostitutes, and it was, and then the prostitutes would get pregnant and they'd kill the baby. Right, they exposure of unwanted infants, and so you always have sexual immorality tied together with murder, and so they were worshiping, most of them were fertility rites, and the Baal was the male god, and they worshipped him by having a pole, right, like in Egypt you would have the those pillars that would go up, right? They I don't want to talk about too much of this, but it was like a phallic symbol.
Mm-hmm.
And then Ashtaroth was the female god. And that's where you get the word Esther, because Esther, right, that's the Babylonian version of the name Astarte or Ashtaroth. And actually that's where the word Easter came from, right? So we celebrate the fulfillment of the Passover,
yes,
but the Bible translators put in the word Easter. And it stuck. But anyway, most pagan cultures have a male, female deities amongst others, but those are the main ones, and it all has to do with fertility. So that they could have a nice crop, but unfortunately, it was, sacrifice your firstborn child to this, god or goddess so that you can have a fertile field or something, but it all ends up with this child sacrifice, sexual immorality, and God hated that, and he gave the Canaanites 400 years to repent, and when they didn't, he said that he brought the Israelites in to judge them. Mm-hmm. And then later, the prophets tell this wicked king Manasseh, they said, you're killing kids. You're sacrificing kids to Moloch. You're doing the same thing that the people that were here before Israel came and did. And because they did it, I brought Israel in to drive them out. And because you're doing it, I'm going to drive you out. And that's when Judah was taken captive to Babylon.
So we have this Moloch, we have Baphomet, we have Baal. These are demonic entities. These are made-up gods. But if we take, for instance, the Bible, we have what? We have Satan, Lucifer, which is the same as Satan, right? And he has lots of names like the Morning Star, etc. So Baal,
and Satan means
they are not the same, right? They are just demons, or this is just the another naming of the Satan or Lucifer. Let's say, for instance, Baphomet or Baal.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're probably demons, but you have. The Bible, Jesus casting out the devil, and they said, have you come to torment us before the time? And he asked another one, what's your name? Legion, for we are many, Mm-hmm. So there's different spirits that are fallen. The book of Ezekiel and Isaiah give us an insight that Lucifer was a beautiful angel, and at some point he said, I will put my throne above the throne of God. I will ascend to the mountain of the north. I will be like God. I'll be like the Most High. And God said, no, you're not. And he cast him out. And so Jesus said, I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. Mm-hmm. Says he was a murderer from the beginning and he's the father of lies, right? And so he's cast down, and but it says that he pulled a third of the angels with them. That's what the book of Revelation talks about. You know, the dragon is cast out, but he takes a third of the stars with him. So it's symbolic that, so they're cast down to earth, and so it says that Satan is the god of this world, or the word cosmos, or this world system. I wrote another book called Change to Change. So I read through 6,000 years of history, right? So writing was invented around 3300 BC. Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. Today that's Iraq. And so writing, it was invented around 3300 BC. And we're around 2080, so that's around 5,300 years, you know, maybe around a little less than 6,000 years of human beings writing down human records, right? So it's not that long. You know, if you think of it, 6,000 years is just 60 people living 100 years each back to back. And we've all met someone who's lived 100 years, maybe a grandmother. We're talking 60 grandmothers, right? The 60 people living 100 years each back to back is 6,000 years. And so now that we look at these 6,000 years, the most common form of government is a king. Nimrod, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan, Tsar, Maharaja, Genghis Khan, Julius Caesar, Attila the Hun, Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, right? You always have a pyramid structure to society. A king is a glorified gang leader. And so the default setting for human government is gangs. If you were to get rid of all police, give it a couple weeks, and you'll have gangs.
Anarchy.
And the toughest gang will try to fight the others. And
basically Mexico.
Well, yeah, or inner cities. Pick any inner city. You have gangs, and if you're loyal to the gang leader, you're more equal. If you're not loyal to the gang leader, you're less equal. And if you're the enemy of the gang leader, you're dead. Right? So Islam, right? If you can, you're free to join Islam, but if you want to leave Islam, they'll kill you. So you're free to join the Bloods and the Crips and whatever gang, but if you want to leave the gang will gang up on you and kill you. And so the default setting for human government is gang leader kings. And as the centuries go on, the kingdoms get bigger because the latest military advancement, the kings can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with a bronze weapon or an iron weapon or a big long phalanx spear that the Greeks had, Alexander the Great, or a scimitar sword that the Muslims had, or China, who invented gunpowder, right? The weapon keeps improving, but it's that same fallen nature of Cain killing Abel. And with technological advancements, the kings can track more people. So Augustus Caesar, 2 BC, wanted to have a worldwide tracking system called a census, a tax enrollment. If Caesar could have had access to 5G and cell phones and facial recognition software, I bet he'd been tempted to use that. Right? So you always have kings using the most modern weapons to control people and using technology to track people. And that's exactly what Plato talked about. Plato, in his Perfect Society, right? He talked about that you would have to have an internal passport, that you couldn't just travel, you had to get permission. In other words, and then Sir Thomas More said everybody's tracked everywhere they go. This is, in 1600 or so when he writes this. And so this idea of the default setting is gang leader kings who want to control people with weapons and track people with technology. And it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger until the King of England was the biggest. The sun never set on the British Empire. The British controlled India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guiana, Canada, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, right in America. The King of England was a globalist. He was a one world government guy with him at the top. America's founders had the chance to break away and flip it and make the people the king. So the word citizen is Greek. It means co-ruler, co-sovereign, co-king. So kings have subjects who are subjected to their will. Republics have citizens. And the word citizen means a co-ruler. And so when we pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, we're basically pledging allegiance to we the people being in charge of ourselves. It's a bottom-up form of government versus a top-down form of government. So America is an experiment of a polarity change in the flow of power. Instead of pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers and Khans and sultans and czars ruling top-down, it's bottom-up, we the people. And several ingredients were necessary for America to get this chance. One is a 3,000-mile ocean. Two, Europe was the chessboard. And kings would fight over little borders. America, we didn't have gold like Mexico and Inca Peru. What did America have? Beaver skins,
land,
tobacco, dried fish. I mean, they really weren't money makers. And the first colony of Virginia, Jamestown, went bankrupt. When one winter, 500 people died in Jamestown, Virginia. Sir Walter Raleigh was a rich guy, and he put up the money to found a Roanoke colony in Virginia, and it went bankrupt. And the people left and went off to live with the Indians. So America was this afterthought. So Europe was the chessboard, and the King of England was like, just stay out of my hair. Just don't cost me any money. Mm-hmm. Just do whatever you want in America for a century. And the people got to rule themselves, and they had training wheels like a bicycle, and they got this chance of ruling themselves, and it worked. And then you look at another ingredient was New England. Now, Virginia was a king-run colony, but New England, which is Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, New England was founded by Puritans. Mm-hmm. And then Pilgrims and Baptists and Presbyterians and Quakers, and then New York by the Dutch Reform. And they followed Calvin, called Calvinists, from Switzerland and France. And Calvin studied the Bible, but what part of the Bible? The first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. So king is the norm, but there's an anomaly. There's this one nation that stands out unique, mm-hmm. Ancient Israel, before King Saul. So around 1400 BC.
With judges.
Right. So around 1400 BC, you have millions of Israelites come out of Egypt. They come into the Promised Land, and for 4 centuries, there's no king. Mm-hmm. They're ruled by the law. The priests teach them the law, and they're taught 3 things. 1, God is watching you all the time. God wants you to be fair, and God's going to hold you accountable in the future. Mm-hmm. So you're about to steal something, nobody's around, and then you think, God's watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates a tiny thing in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country believes this, you can maintain order with no king who rules through fear. And it worked until the priests went woke and they stopped teaching the law. The high priest, Eli, his own sons were sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. Right? Another story in the book of Judges, a Levite in the house of a guy named Micah with a silver graven image. And the tribe of Dan comes along and steals the graven image and then tells this Levite, come along with us. You can be a priest to our whole tribe with this graven image. And you're like, isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have graven images, and here's a Levite with one? And then the terrible story at the end of the book of Judges where there's a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite is to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with the woman he's not even married to. He's not following the law. And they're traveling, and their house gets surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that appears at the last stages of a people ruling themselves. This casting off of self-restraint, no borders, no guidelines, just raw passion. And the poor concubine gets raped to death. And then all the people go to Samuel the prophet, and they say, this self-government system is no longer working. The priests aren't teaching the law. Nobody's following it. Nobody fears God anymore. And we want to be like the other countries. We want a king. And Samuel cries, and the Lord tells Samuel, they did not reject you, they rejected me. And then they get a King Saul, and they flip from a bottom-up form of government, boom, to a top-down form of government with Saul. And what does Saul do? He is pouting that his son Jonathan became friends with David. And he turns to his soldiers, and he says, all you soldiers know about this, and none of you are helping me. And one soldier, Doeg the Edomite, says, King, I'm your friend. I saw David go to this town, and the priests there gave him some bread and the sword of Goliath that was stored there. Saul says, tell the priest to come here. The priests show up. He turns to his soldiers, and he says, kill them all. And the soldiers hesitate. And Doeg the Edomite goes out there and kills them all, about 70 of the priests. What just happened? The soldiers were operating under the old system, where every individual is accountable to God to follow the law, and the law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn somebody to death. There's only one witness, this Doeg guy, so the soldiers are hesitating. They still have a conscience. They're like, oh, King, you're telling me to kill him, but I'm accountable to God, and God says there's going to be 2 witnesses. There's only one. They're hesitating. They have a conscience. Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. Tell me to kill the baby in the womb, I'll kill it. Tell me there's no more male and female. Tell me kids can be furries. Tell me I'm just a bunch of bush. You blow the trumpet, I'll bow to your statue. Right? The government always wants to get between you and God. Dictator kings always want to get between you. Nebuchadnezzar, right? I blow the trumpet, you bow. Kings of England, right? Sir Thomas More, if you don't switch, I'm going to get you killed, right? And so what happened was in America, you had people fleeing from these countries in Europe. And so they wanted religious freedom. So Virginia was founded by Anglicans. Massachusetts was founded by Puritans. Rhode Island was founded by Baptists. Connecticut and New Hampshire were founded by Congregationalists. New York was founded by Dutch Reformed. Delaware and New Jersey were founded by Swedish Lutherans. Gustav Adolphus of Sweden was very powerful, and he wanted to have a new Sweden. And at the time, Sweden controlled Estonia, Lithuania, parts of Poland, parts of Russia. And so here you were, there were Lithuanians helping to found Delaware and New Jersey, right? They came over in boats, they had colonies, and they lasted for a couple decades until they got into a little tiff with the Dutch. And there was a Dutch Fort Christina, and one winter, the Swedes took it. And they got away with it. But the next year, the Dutch sends their navy over. It doesn't just take the fort back, it takes all of New Sweden. And now it's controlled by the Dutch. But then the British conquer the Dutch, and the British take it all over, and it becomes Delaware and New Jersey. But the oldest church in Philadelphia, right there by New Jersey, is Old Swedes Church. Right? And so the colonies at first did not get along, the same way that the countries in Europe didn't get along. But then they all had to work together against the King of England. They're like, look, we don't agree with you on religion and everything, but none of us want to be Anglican, and the king's forcing us to pay taxes to this Anglican denomination, and you want to be, there were Baptists and Presbyterians and Lutherans, and one Catholic signed the Declaration, and they said, look, let's all work together against the king, and then afterwards we can all do whatever we want. But their attitude changed to, you were willing to fight and die for my freedom. I need to let you practice your faith. And so they began to tolerate each other. So each state expanded religious tolerance at their own speeds. So Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, they were like giving they let Jews come in, right? And Massachusetts stayed a Puritan Congregationalist colony up until 1833. You could not hold office in Massachusetts unless you were a Puritan Congregationalist up until the year 1833. But each state could decide. But their one fear was the new federal government might pick one denomination and make it the national, which is what every other country in the world did. And that was their only frame of reference, that the big government is going to pick one denomination, right? And so they wanted to have a First Amendment to tie the federal government's hands so religion would stay under the state's jurisdiction so they could do whatever they wanted. Anyway, but I know I've wandered all around.
No, I love it. I learned so much. So right now in America, we don't have from top to the bottom, right? Because we have elections, you have elections, I'm not the citizen of the US, so Trump is now the president. But would you say that right now the riots and the uprising of a company called Palantir may do everything that is going to bring you back from top to bottom with the technocracy?
Yeah.
Are you fearful of that company and of that technology?
Yeah, so if I can put together a couple other history stories, you have Britain wants to take over India, the British East India Company.
Yes.
India was a bunch of kingdoms. The British land in
1600s?
1714. Mm-hmm. So 1714, a British ship sort of got off course, landed in Bengal. The king had a son that was sick, and the British guy doctored him up, and he survived, and the king was happy and says, here, I want to give you some gold. And the British guy said, you know what, I'd really like a trading post. And they're like, fine, okay. And so this trading post turned into a trading fort. And then the British had guns in the fort. And then the British would learn the politics, and then they would give guns to one of these Indian kingdoms, and then they would give guns to the other one, and then they would stir up animosity between them, maybe racial, maybe ancient, hatred that they had for, and stir them up until they would fight each other and bloody each other and weaken each other, and then the British could come in and conquer both of the weakened kingdoms. And they did this again and again and again till they took over all of India, a quarter of the world's population. And then you look at the British tried to do it in America during the Revolutionary War. The British went to the Indians and promised them money for scalps. And you scalp the Americans, right? We'll pay you. And it got so bad that it's listed as one of the 27 reasons in the Declaration of why we were rebelling against the king. It says the king has incited insurrection among us with the merciless Indian savages who are butchering the inhabitants of our frontiers, right? And so this idea is you want to conquer a country, you got to go in and find the divisions between them. And so when the Belgians colonized the Congo in Africa.
Leopold II.
Yeah, Leopold. And they measured their heights and their features, and they would classify them, you're a Hutu and you're a Tutsi. Well, prior to that, the people all just got along with each other. Some were tall, some were short. Hey, we're all just family. But now and then they made them go down to the government offices and register as Hutus and Tutsis and begin to identify with those two groups. And then they began to pit them against each other. And they began to massacre and genocide each other. And then in the confusion, the colonizing power could take control of the whole country.
That was even before Rwanda, the civil war in Rwanda. Correct. In the 1990s, right?
Yeah.
That was way before that.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this was the 1800s. And then you have a king, interesting, but Machiavelli lived in Italy 500 years ago. Italy was a bunch of city-states, Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena, and they didn't get along.
Correct.
And Machiavelli thought, well, if one prince could control all of the Italian-speaking kingdoms, there would be peace. So his end was good, but his attitude was the ends justifies the means.
And at the same time, sorry, Machiavelli was who at that moment?
500 years ago in Italy.
Yeah, but he was who? Government official?
He was more or less an assistant of Caesar Borgia. And, Lorenzo de' Medici and all those rich Florentine
Banks,
families.
Pope.
And this Borgia guy was like wicked. He would do anything for power. There's even, rumors that he raped his own sister. I mean, he was like just corrupt. But Machiavelli studied him and wrote his book called The Prince. Mm-hmm. And he said, okay, the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is a good end because it'll stop all the infighting. But any means necessary to get there is justified. So if a prince wants to conquer a city and the city does not want to be conquered, they would hate him. But if the prince pays criminals to kill cows, burn barns, smash windows, set things on fire, the people will cry out for help. The prince will come in, get rid of the very criminals he bribed to create the problem. Nobody will know the better for it, and everyone will praise the prince as a hero.
From chaos to order.
Yeah, and so you have a guy in Germany called Hagel, and he takes what the British were doing, what the Machiaveli was talking about, and he makes it into a nice, neat triangle, right? Germans like to get things all organized, and so Napoleon conquers Europe, and the king of Prussia afterwards said, we got conquered so easy by Napoleon, we need to strengthen our state so that we don't get conquered that easy again. And he has a philosopher at the University of Berlin named Hegel, Hegel. And Hegel had a student named Karl Marx. And so Hegel made it a triangle. One corner is a thesis, the opposite corner is an antithesis or antithesis, and the top corner is a synthesis. It sounds complicated, but it's not. You start off the status quo, everybody's used to what's going on, and you create a problem that's really bad, and everybody will panic and fear and cry out for somebody to come along and restore order. And then you have this philosopher king like Plato, right? Out of that chaos, somebody will come along and says, I'll restore order. I just need some temporary emergency power. And once the people give up their power, it doesn't come back. But then Hegel says, okay, that now becomes the new thesis. Then you create another problem that's really bad, and everybody panics in fear and gives up some more of their freedom to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. And then that becomes the new thesis starting point. You create another problem that's real bad, and everybody gives up some more of their freedom to settle for an answer that's just half as bad. And you begin to move across the page from the people being free to the people surrendering all their power to the government. And so Karl Marx said, well, how do you create a problem that's real bad? You send in agitators, agent provocateurs, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job is to go into a country, observe all the groups, and pit them against each other. And so Karl Marx, the first division was the proletariat versus the bourgeois, which is the working class versus the business owners.
The rich.
And you would stir them up to fight, and then they would overthrow the elites and royalty, and then they would. And so it got to the place where some countries, they didn't have a division there, so they would make the division based on religion.
Countries like what?
You'd have the Sunni, the Shia, the Orthodox. You would have, Bosnia and the Croats and the Serbs and India, the different tribes. And then they would base it on color, blacks versus whites, or Catholics versus Protestants, like in Ireland. Or Muslims versus Christians. Didn't matter who the two sides are. Didn't matter what the issues are. The goal is to sow chaos and division so that everybody panics in fear and says, government, please, please, please come in and restore order. And the government says, okay, we'll restore order. But in the process, we're going to take away all your guns. We're going to take away all your freedom so that we're martial law. You can't just wander the streets and we're going to have to track you. And you're going to have to give up your privacy. But and so this, Castro even said, when he did communism in Cuba, he says, the revolution needs the enemy. The revolutionary needs his antithesis, which is the counter-revolutionary. In other words, you can't get the people to give up their freedom if everything's fine. You have to create a problem that gets them to panic and fear. Then they'll give up their freedom to settle for an answer just half as bad. And so in the Bible, Jesus talked about this. He says, if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. Lincoln gave a speech during the Civil War, which says a house divided cannot stand. It's introducing an autoimmune disease into the body politic. What's an autoimmune disease?
It fights itself.
It's where your own immune system is attacking your own organs and joints. You got inflammation. You got fire. You got a war going on inside of your own body. Your body is fighting your body. And so the idea is you go into a body politic, a country, and you introduce an autoimmune disease. You get it to fight each other, and it weakens the whole country so it can get conquered. And so how do you destroy a marriage? Sow discord. How do you destroy a family? Sow discord. How do you destroy a church? Sow discord. How do you destroy a country? Sow discord. And so the critical race theory is so this is called the color revolution. All right, you want to go into a country and so after World War II, you had new countries happy to be free from the Nazis, and they're forming republics and electing new leaders, and they're climbing up out of the war, and the Soviets didn't like that. And so they would send in KGB agents to do critical theory, which is simply observing all the groups in a country. Ethnic groups, religious groups, economic groups, and then they would classify them as victims or oppressors, haves and have-nots. And then they would stir up the have-nots to riot. And then they would break it into bloodshed and killing. Why that? Because then people think emotionally and not logically. So instead of sitting down and talking logically about forms of government, it's like, my friend just got killed. I don't want to talk about stuff. It's that person killed my friend. And then people want to blame somebody for the killings. And so they get control of the media and channel all that frustration at the new leader of the new republic. It's his fault. He's messed up. And as his popularity falls, then they could do a coup or a rigged election, and nobody would challenge it because by this time they didn't like the leader. And then they replaced the leader with a Soviet puppet. And country after country was falling. It's called behind the Iron Curtain. Mm-hmm. And so this tactic, Harry S. Truman does nothing while these countries are falling behind the Iron Curtain in the 1950s for the 48, 49, and 50s. And the next president is, because Truman started the United Nations, and Truman said, oh, we're going to let the United Nations work. And the Soviets had somebody on the Security Council of the United Nations. So they knew everything that was going on. It's like, But then Eisenhower becomes the president. And Eisenhower is, okay, we can do nothing or we can do something. And so the head of the CIA is Allen Dulles. His brother, John Foster Dulles, is the Secretary of State that Dulles Airport is named after in Virginia. Allen Dulles is the head of the CIA. And Iran is beginning to lean and side with the Soviet Union. And Eisenhower doesn't like that, and so he gives approval for Operation Ajax.
And at that time, Iran is ruled by Shah already.
No. This is before the Shah. This is Mossadegh.
The Shah ruled from 42?
No. This is Mossadegh, and the year is 1953.
Okay. Shah arrived later.
Right.
The Revolution 79.
Yeah, I mean, the Shah had a claim to power beforehand.
Yes.
And so he was involved in the government, but then Mossadegh was elected, but he was elected probably with the help of the communists. Mm-hmm. But never, whether he was or he wasn't, he began to lean toward communism. And America, Eisenhower, we don't want Iran to be communist. And so Allen Dulles sends Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. He's an expert in foreign languages. They send him to Tehran, and he does the KGB thing in reverse. He recruits gangsters and mobsters and radical imams, and he organizes riots and protests, and they attack mosques, and then they get control of the media and blame Mossadegh for all of the problems. And as people believe the media, Mossadegh's popularity falls. Again, it's called Operation Ajax. When it falls enough, they did a house arrest of Mossadegh and lock him away for the rest of his life till he died. And they brought back the Shah. And the Shah loved America because we supported him and we put him in until Jimmy Carter betrayed the Shah and put in the Ayatollah.
Yeah, and did the same thing with the Shah, right?
Correct. Jimmy
They burned
Carter.
the cinema full of people
Yeah.
in Tehran. Okay.
Yeah. So the story is that they had They had people dress up as Shah's soldiers and burn the people in the theater. And so the Shah would get blamed for it, even though the Shah wasn't behind it. But the people blamed him for it. And then Jimmy Carter instead of supporting the Shah, Jimmy Carter pulled back.
Why?
Because he had a globalist advisor named Zbigniew Brzezinski. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, his daughter is Nika Brzezinski, who's a MSNBC TV host. But Zbigniew Brzezinski was saying, okay, we instead of letting Iran fall to being, supporting it or letting it be Soviet, let's let it be fundamentalist Islamic. And so Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer in Georgia. And he got David Rockefeller and a bunch of these globalists got behind Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign. And when Jimmy Carter got elected, they appointed all of Jimmy Carter's administration. And so Jimmy Carter, a Baptist, a nice guy, could talk Christian lingo, but his entire administration was globalists, pro-abortion, left-wing people. And
but Shah was loyal to the U.S.
Yeah.
Why did you say that Iran was going to be friends with Russia?
Well, that was Zbigniew Brzezinski's argument, and I don't believe it. I believe that if America would have stood solidly with the Shah, he could have stayed in.
Who do you think brought Khomeini from France? He arrived from France, right?
Yeah, Jimmy Carter was in communication with the Ayatollah in France. So his administration was part of subversively bringing him back to Iran because they want to destabilize. So they think of the world as a big chessboard, right? And they want global crises so they can have the whole world. Remember George H.W. Bush, right? He says, this war in Iraq, it's terrible, but out of it will come a new world order. Right? And it's like, what is it? You need a crisis that's really bad so that everybody can say we need a big government power to come in and restore order.
But they need this unlimited power because they can't help themselves? It's like in their nature to rule over people?
Yeah, it's a gang leader.
Because if you're a president, it's like you're on top of the world, especially if you're the president of the U.S. It's like for 4 years minimum, you're like top guy. Maybe the CIA is more powerful than you.
Yeah, but the globalists view politicians as employees.
All of them?
A good percentage. So you cannot get elected unless you have money to buy advertising. And unless you're Trump with billions of dollars, that's why he is unique. Every other politician has to go to the people with the money and sell themselves.
Yeah, but Mr. Federer, once again, Palantir, it's scary. On paper, it's good. But you never know how can they adjust the knobs so it can turn against us, regular citizen.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, so you have the Jimmy Carter abandons the Shah, lets the Ayatollah take over, and then you have the U.S. under Ronald Reagan arming and training Saddam Hussein and Iraqis to fight the Iranians in the Iraq-Iran war from 1980 to 1988. And so Saddam was our friend until George H.W. Bush said, no, he's the bad guy, and we switched. And then you had Reagan arming and training the Taliban to fight the Soviet Union during the Soviet-Afghan war. right? This is the Cold War, and there are these what they call proxy wars, where the Soviets will back one group, the Americans will back the other group, and the two groups will be fighting. Everybody knows it's the two superpowers behind them, but they we're not really that involved, but really they are, So they call them proxy wars.
Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea, right?
Yeah. And so the U.S. was arming and training the Taliban during the Soviet-Afghan war. It's called Operation Cyclone, right? You can Google Operation Cyclone. I wrote about it in a book, called Socialism, but one of the Taliban that was trained by the U.S. was Osama bin Laden, and then you have Bill Clinton, and he's having his Monica Lewinsky scandal. And by the way, the Soviet-Afghan war is the largest covert CIA operation. Covert means nobody in America knows about it, but they're doing it anyway. And so Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts did a movie. It's called Charlie Wilson's War.
Correct.
And it's about this covert operation of the U.S. arming and training the Taliban to fight the Soviets. And Sylvester Stallone did a movie.
Rambo.
It's called Rambo 3.
Why do you think they make these movies like Charlie Wilson's War? Just to brag about it? Like, listen, this is what we did 30 years ago? Because the movie came out, I want to say, 2005 to 2006.
I don't know. I do know that during Bill Clinton's term, he's fooling around with Monica Lewinsky. The press is talking impeachment,
Mm-hmm.
and Bill Clinton fires some missiles into Serbia. And we have the Bosnian-Serbian War. And Bill Clinton, I think it's called Operation Deliberate Force, but he funnels U.S. military weapons through Iran and the Ayatollah to the Bosnian Muslims to fight the Serbian Christians. And so afterwards, the Bosnian Muslims have a statue to Bill Clinton in downtown Kosovo, right? And so, and then you have Biden. 20 years of Americans fighting to free Afghanistan. Biden pulls the American troops out, gives away $85 billion worth of the most sophisticated U.S. weapons, gives them the biggest military base between China and Europe. And I talked to soldiers who said Chinese planes were flying in while American planes were evacuating people out.
Do you think that was on purpose?
Because of lithium for batteries.
No. Do you think he left all the equipment on purpose, or
Yeah. And so what happened was Afghanistan has rare earth metals for batteries like lithium, and Biden was giving that to China. And I actually had an Uber driver one time, and he said, "I'm a Black Hawk helicopter. I got my wings. I was trained by the Americans." He says, "We could have taken out the Taliban so easily. They were on motorcycles and pickup trucks. We had armed Black Hawk with missiles and everything. We could have taken it out, but we got an order to stand down." He says, "My friends landed their helicopters in Tajikistan because they knew if they landed in Afghanistan, they'd be killed." And he said he landed in Afghanistan and he had to flee for 10 days in hiding. Finally, he contacted his trainer in America, and he got him out. And he goes, "Now I'm driving Uber and I work at Panera Bread." He goes, "But I'm an educated man. I got my wings," right? But he said, yeah, that the China. He says, yeah, they were saying we don't want Americans in here. That was their mantra, their motto. We don't want foreigners to rule our country. He goes, but now the Chinese are ruling Afghanistan, right? I talked to soldiers that after their term, they would go back as contractors and defend a power plant or a water plant. He goes, they're defending the same power plant, but now only for the Chinese. And so, and then you have Benghazi with Obama and Hillary Clinton, and Gaddafi. He's sort of mixed, but he gave up all of his nuclear weapons, right, to America. He wanted, but he was hoarding gold and was thinking about coming up with an alternative to the U.S. dollar, and
But did he really have the nuclear weapons? Did he get it from?
He gave them up. He
from
gave
India?
them up. Pardon?
He get it from India?
Because Libya.
Yeah, I know, but Libya is not a big country, and it's not a prosperous country. So how did they manage to develop the nuclear weapon?
I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that he made a phone call to the United States when he saw the United States, attacking, I guess, Saddam. And he's like, okay, look, take my missiles and take it all. And he thought he was going to be treated nice. But instead, under Hillary, they take out Gaddafi. And then they're moving the weapons over to Syria because they want to take out Assad. Assad was Alawite. And the Alawites were moderate Muslims. And so
it's wild.
And so I actually talked to a soldier that was there at Benghazi, and he says our government, the U.S. government, was told not to come to their rescue. Right? I mean, it was terrible. But Assad was viewing Syria as he felt a responsibility to protect the minorities, including the Christians, and John Kerry wanted to get rid of Assad, all these different ones. And if you realize the getting rid of Assad started when Biden was still in office. And that's when the war started, and then Trump inherited it. And so when the Taliban, or whatever the group is, because they changed names up, but whatever the violent Islamic group was that took over after Assad fled to Russia, killed tens of thousands of Alawites, these moderate Muslims.
And Christians.
All Christian minorities just killed under these fundamental, ISIS type Muslims. And so we like to think of two sides, like, chess, it's you against me. It's actually more like Chinese checkers. There's multiple sides, right? And so sometimes they'll want to get one thing going so that they can distract for something else, or they can take power from something else, or they can weaken these two, and they can, but the goal is a one world government. And so the same way that you have groups Hagel commit the crisis that's real bad and everybody surrenders their freedom to settle for an answer that's half as bad, they want to do that on a global level. And they also want to not just do it, but they want to blame you for the crisis that they start.
Gaslight.
It's gaslighting. It's also called projection. And so it's a natural phenomenon. Little kids, I didn't start the fight, you did.
Mm-hmm.
The aggressor blames the victim. A cheating spouse will accuse the faithful spouse of being unfaithful. And so I actually have a military review magazine from 1960 December issue, and it has an article, a review of Soviet psychological warfare, and it says, this is an example of propaganda technique of name calling. It is what the psychologists call projection. If you do something wrong, accuse the enemy of doing it before he accuses you. He says the one who makes the accusation first has the advantage, because many people believe any charge without investigating. He says a person ascribes to his opposition his own motives, right? So if you wanted to be something bad, you accuse them of wanting to steal the election. He says we have all heard children claim he hit me first in order to escape blame for a fight. The Soviet Union behaved in the same childish way. So this is a U.S. military review magazine talking about you blame the other side for what you're doing. The first one to do it. So this projection, so it's in the Bible. Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of lusting after her when she was lusting after him.
You're right.
Right? And Nero set fire to Rome and he blamed the Christians. And so this tactic, David Axelrod was an advisor to President Obama. And on NPR radio, April 19th, 2010, David Axelrod said, in Chicago, there was an old tradition of throwing a brick through your own campaign office window and then calling a press conference to say you've been attacked. So you throw the brick at your own window and then you call the media together, says, somebody threw the brick and it was probably my opponent. And the opponent's like, smeared in the news because their name gets associated with this opponent is accused of throwing. I didn't throw the brick, but they keep repeating that story until it grows legs, and people make a mental connection of this person with this crime. So most people skim articles, and so the anyway.
When you say globalists, who are those people?
George Soros.
From what countries? Let's name the countries that they are not in. Russians, Indians, Chinese, are globalists from those countries too?
George Soros is the most well-known. Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum, Davos, Bilderbergers.
Bilderberg is happening now.
Yeah.
At this moment.
Yeah. And
this weekend.
And it's when you get up to that level, it's eat or be eaten. In other words, if you don't buy up other companies, some other company will buy you up. And so it's like, an aggressive posture. It starts off with something as simple of you have a painting company and you have an opportunity to get a contract with the city, and you can become the biggest painting company in the city because you're now getting money from, and then you're now one of the biggest painting companies in the state, and you have some friends in the state that can funnel the business to your company. Now you become the biggest company in the state, and then you're on the national level. And you pay for some politicians, get them elected, and they get in office, and they are giving a government contract to you, and now you're getting billions of dollars. Well, guess what? It happens on a global level. And they're like, hey, we can destabilize this. We can, come in and reconstruct these cities. We'll get all this money. And then they want to, corner the markets on banking, the whole climate change thing. Al Gore wanted to have global carbon credits. Right? And so every activity of breathing out carbon dioxide, you have to pay a tax, right? And then they would trade these taxes. It's all these schemes.
That was when he was running in the 2000?
Well, I mean, he still started doing it, but it's sort
Nobody's listening to the guy.
Yeah, nobody's listening to him, yeah. And but
he said he will be drowned by 2020.
Pardon?
He said we'll be drowned in water by 2020.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. It's fear. So there's two ways to get people to give up their freedom. One is fear, and the other is free stuff. And so a drug dealer takes over a neighborhood two ways. He can come in with guns, get people into fear, and they submit to the mob and pay, extortion money. Or the drug dealer is so nice, he's giving away free drugs until you get hooked. And then you want some more free drugs, you're going to have to sell yourself into prostitution. You're going to have to give up your freedom to keep it. And so the two ways the government takes over and brings socialism and communism, which is just another term for dictatorship, which is another term for a top-down pyramid structure with a pharaoh on top, right? But it's just a communist dictator, Xi Jinping, right? Whoever. And so they want to destabilize the country financially. And so everybody goes to the government and says, government, help. And the government says, we'll help, but you're going to have to sign up for welfare. And you're like, oh, okay, thank you. And then you get dependent on the free money. And then like, okay, we made a new rule. If you want to continue the free money, you have to give up your guns. It's like, well, okay. And then, okay, now if you want to continue the free money, you're going to have to get these shots. And if you want to continue the free money, you're going to have to let us track you everywhere you go. And people are backdoored, and it's actually called the Cloward-Piven strategy. Mm-hmm. So 1950s, 1940s, you have the 30s and 40s, you have FDR, and you have the Soviets, the socialists in America. They actually started a U.S. A Communist Party, right? And then they ran candidates, and so forth. And but they infiltrated FDR's administration. And Columbia University in New York were taken over by these leftist professors. And Richard Cloward, Francis Piven were socialist professors at Columbia University. And they said, well, you're not going to bring socialism into America with tanks, but you can do it through the back door. And you can destabilize the economy and get everybody to sign up for welfare. And once they sign up for welfare, you gradually, incrementally give them to get up their freedoms until you control the population that way.
But the question remains, why do they hand this information to us? Why are they telling their plans? Because if we know the plan, we can fight back.
Well,
they don't care. They're so arrogant.
Yeah, quite honest. You know, it's sort of like Islam will do that. They say, we're here to take over. And everybody's like, oh, yeah, you don't really mean that. You know, but yeah, you know, there's a bunch
they
of
do that in the United Kingdom right now. It's like, everybody's like, nah.
I just
no worries.
bumped that.
It's okay. You're good.
And so, and now with AI, it gets really interesting. University of Zurich did a study, and they looked at Reddit, Reddit.
The forum.
It's a website where you post questions and answers.
Yes.
And they had AI do gather all the information and build a profile on each user. They looked at all their posts, all their comments, and they got this. And then they had bots, right? Computer-generated things that will post answers. They found out that these bots, these AI computer posts, were 6 times more effective in getting people to change their views than humans are. They can study you and know everything.
Where to poke.
Yeah, they know your fears and your pleasures. Those are the 2 things, your pain and your pleasure. They know what you're afraid of. Oh, healthcare scare, financial scare, right? And then they can motivate you that way, or they can lure you with the pleasures, right? And so they build a profile on each person so good that they'll know you better than you know yourself, and they know what buttons to push, what articles to send your way, and it motivates people to adopt the government-approved views. Now, these tactics were perfected for 50 years during the Cold War. The Soviets would do these tactics to take Western countries and bring them behind the Iron Curtain or behind the bamboo curtain, right over in the Far East. But then the American CIA would do it in reverse. And Obama is the one that took these CIA psychological tools and turned them inward on the American population for political purposes.
Why?
Because he likes political power.
But he can stay in power for only 8 years, which he did.
Yeah, but the deep state globalists, he's like a front man for them. And so, and Biden was a puppet. He was completely controlled by them. He had an auto pen. He didn't know what was going on. He was just the front. So these globalists. So Obama's the one that signed this act in 2015 called, is an executive order called Using Behavioral Sciences for the Benefit of the American Public. It's like, what's using behavioral? It's psyops. It's the same psychological operations that the CIA would do to overthrow countries over there, right? Create a crisis, blame the leader, overthrow the leader. Obama wanted to do that against his political opponents, right? Blame them for all the problems. And then in 2016, Obama signed Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act, which allowed him to decide what is disinformation and cancel it. And
they implemented this in 4 years in 2020 with the COVID. You say something that goes against the truth, according to them, you get banned.
Yeah. So it's I write about this in my book called Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present, and then I have a whole chapter in there on psychological warfare, which is quite interesting. It's where you go through Karl von Clausewitz was a 19th century German military strategist. And he gave the classic definition of the purpose for war. The purpose for war is to get your opponent to submit to your will. So all the battlefield, all the guns, all the strategies, to do what? To get your opponent to submit to your will. Sun Tzu's Art of War, 5th century BC China, said supreme excellence in a commander is to get your enemy to surrender without a fight. So, yeah, you fight, you win, but wait a second, if you can get them to submit without a fight, you're even better. Mm-hmm. So you make them be demoralized, confused, in fear, and you make your side look more powerful than you really are. Now it's called 5th generation warfare, where you get your enemy to surrender without them being aware they're even in a war. If the goal is to get them to submit to your will, why even let them know there's a war going on? Just get them into fear and they'll surrender. And so this psyops was done during World War II, where the Allies would fly planes over Nazi-occupied territories and drop pamphlets down in that country's language that would say your side has already lost, and they were like, your commander just hasn't told you yet. And so these guys are out there fighting. They're like, I read this pamphlet, said we already lost. It's like, yeah, I read the same thing too. It's like, oh, why are we out here fighting, you know? And I actually talked to a guy from Poland, and he had one of these flyers that his granddad had saved, but it was a propaganda flyer. And then the Japanese did it to the Americans with Tokyo Rose. A woman had a very seductive voice, and the radio waves would go across the ocean to the ships and say, you Americans are terrible, you're horrible, you're doing this bad stuff and this bad. And our guys would be like listening, and it would demoralize them. And it's in the Bible. So 12 spies went into the promised land. 10 came back with a negative report. Mm-hmm. There's giants in the land. The land devours the inhabitants thereof. We're grasshoppers in their sight. And the people get wrapped up in fear, saying, stone Moses and let's go back to Egypt. On the brink of victory, they lost the battle in their mind. They never even made it to the fight. They were defeated in their mind, this fear. And then in reverse, Gideon did it. There's 100,000 Midianites. Gideon gets 300. And it was a psychological operation. They get their torches, their clay pots, their trumpets, and they surround this big, huge army. At the right signal, they smash the clay pot, hold up the torch, and blow the trumpet. And these Midianites think they're being attacked from all sides, and they jump up, and they're in the dark. They're like swinging their swords and killing each other, right? And they defeat. And the Gideon's men are just standing there. It was a psychological operation, and so when we understand this, that those people that ultimately want a globalist thing, they want to control what we think, and now with AI, they have, and they want to censor voices. There was, is this interesting?
I'm shocked. I'm like, God bless you.
And so marketing of products in the 1800s was Wells Fargo wagon and Sears catalog. Sears catalog was this big printed catalog with thousands of pages, and it would tell you every detail about a Singer sewing machine, right, or some product, and you would make a very informed purchase. But then in the early 1900s was the beginning of magazine ads and pictures of happy families and happy couples, and then the product. And you would buy it based on your perception that other people like it. Mm-hmm. And the classic was Crisco. It was this white, like butter, but it was fake. And they marketed it so well, it put out of business the lard industry, right? You get bacon, you got lard, and they would use that fat for soap and stuff like that. And they even invented a fake term called vegetable-based. But nobody knew what was in this Crisco. It's cottonseed oil. In the deep South, they would harvest cotton and have these mountains of leftover black seeds. And they would mush them into this mucky oil called industrial seed oil that they would use in factories and machinery. Nobody ate that stuff, but somebody had the idea of bleaching it and putting it in these containers, and now we've all eaten it. So you go from knowing everything about a Singer sewing machine and nothing about some product, but you're ingesting it and eating it. Why? Because you saw this magazine ad that made it look like everybody's using it. And the person that came up with this, his name is Edward Bernays, and he wrote a book called Propaganda in 1928, and he talks about women go into a department store and think they're picking out shoes. They're not. The marketing executive picked out the shoes for them and paid the actors to put them on and paid the photographer to take the pictures and paid to put it in the magazines so women see it in the magazines and want to buy it. He goes, in this way, women are controlled in this part of their lives by this marketing scheme. And he said, today, the minority has discovered a powerful help in influencing the majority to mold the minds of the masses. They find in propaganda a tool which is increasingly powerful, regimenting the public mind. And so what happened is the same marketing campaign to sell a product, they now use to sell a political view or an ideological view by making it look like everybody's using it. There was a cartoon, Keeping Up with the Joneses. So in America, we're government from the consent of the governed. But what if you could engineer the consent of the governed by feeding them this information? And so Edward Bernays wrote a book called The Engineering of Consent. Somebody else wrote a book called The Manufacturing of Consent. And it's based on you thinking that everybody is doing something or everybody's buying something or everybody's holding a view, and there's a human desire to fit in and a human fear of being rejected. And so they're manipulating that. So a water molecule is individual, but you put it with other water molecules and they act as a group, like a wave or a cloud. A fish in a bowl, but you put it with other fish, they operate in a group. A bird in a cage, but you put it with other birds and they operate in a group. Well, we're individuals. You put us with other individuals and we're operating as a group. We always are giving and receiving feedback. Are we being accepted or are we being rejected? And so they manipulate this in schools. Kids want to fit in. They want to be invited to the party and picked for the team. Nobody wants to be not invited to the party and not picked for the team. So they want to be accepted, they fear rejection, and now they've weaponized it. And they call it social emotional learning, behavior modification. And so if a kid comes out as trans, the teacher celebrates them. And the other kids see that, and they see the attention. And then if another kid holds the old-fashioned values, they're like shamed and ridiculed, and you're mean. So they call it the pyramid of oppression. At the top of the pyramid are the cisgendered. That's their term for somebody who believes there is a male and a female. They're at the top of the pyramid. They are the oppressors. Everybody else down the pyramid, asexual, bisexual, transsexual, pansexual, anything sexual, they're being oppressed by the terrible oppressors. And after they teach this to the kids, they ask them, which one are you? Well, none of them are going to pick the oppressor, so they pick, I'm an asexual, I'm a transsexual, I'm anything sexual, right? I'm anything but that, because they're the bad guys.
And they want to be celebrated.
And they've had a 5,000% increase in trans, non-binary kids in the last 5 years because it works. Kids want to be celebrated and fit in and honored, and they don't want to be shamed and left out. Most of the world calls this honor-shame culture. In Asia, it's a big deal. If the group honors you, your worth as a person goes up. If the group shames you, they'll commit suicide. In Islam, they call it the ummah, the community. If your community honors you, your worth goes up. If your daughter embarrasses you by dating a non-Muslim and is not dressed in a burqa, they'll be so embarrassed they'll murder their own daughter because they want to be honored by their group. It's pride. It's the sin of Satan. It's caring about what other people think rather than what God thinks. And so you have Peter is with a group around a fire. And a girl gets in his face and says, you were with Jesus. And you can just picture Peter looking around the group and everybody's eyeing him. And he realizes he's about to get kicked out of the group. And he says, I never met the guy. It's like, that's it, Peter? You caved that quick? It is a real fear to be kicked out of a group, to be shamed, to be blocked, to be canceled, to have somebody post something negative about you on the internet. It hurts. But after the resurrection, Peter's called into the Sanhedrin. And they said, we gave you strict orders not to speak in that name or we'd kick you out of the synagogue. And Peter said, we must obey God rather than men. It's like, whoa. Now Peter doesn't care about being kicked out of a group. What happened to him? He was filled with the Holy Spirit. Right? For 40 days after that, they were with Jesus, but they were still hiding out. But then 10 days later on the Feast of Pentecost, they're filled with the Holy Spirit. What do? They're standing on the street corner and they're preaching the gospel, right? Something about being filled with the Holy Spirit is you can't be silent. You got to speak out. You got to share the gospel. You got to share the love of God. You got to do something, but you also have to stand up against injustice. There's something that cries out. I just can't be quiet when they want to mutilate little innocent children and cut off their private parts, only to have them grow up. Then one video, this poor girl, she goes, I rejected being a woman before I knew what a woman was. I mean, it brings tears to your eyes. I saw another video. This girl said, I shaved my head. They told me I have male pattern baldness and my hair will never come back. I don't know what to say other than this is what happens when a girl takes testosterone for 5 years. And she's heartbroken. And
most of the times it's not even kids themselves, but the parents. The parents want the accolades, especially here in Hollywood. Yeah. My kid is trans. Oh, wow. Like, you're so brave. You're so cool. Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, they love but there was Sam Coonrod was a Giants baseball pitcher, and he did not kneel in protest when everybody's kneeling in protest to the American flag. And afterwards they asked him why. He goes, well, I'm a Christian. I just believe you're not supposed to kneel in front of anybody except God. Amen. It's only when you have a relationship with God can you resist caring about what other people think about you. Cain and Abel. Cain wanted to worship God, but he did it through his works. We know it's works because God told Adam, the ground is cursed for your sake and you'll bring forth fruit by the sweat of your brow. Sweat is work. Cain's trying to work his way to heaven. And if you do works, you can be proud of your works because you do more than the brother did. And when Cain's works were rejected, it says his countenance fell. His pride was hurt. He was embarrassed. I mean, there was only the mom, dad, and brother, but he was embarrassed in front of his group and he got filled full of hatred and anger, wanted to murder his brother. And the brother, Abel, had the revelation of the Lamb. God is on one side, we are on the other side. We've sinned against God and we deserve judgment, but the Lamb takes the judgment in our place. And so throughout history, you always have those that are religion of works wanting to kill those that have the revelation of the Lamb. And who was saved in the Old Testament? The Jews that had trusted in the Lamb. And who saved in the New Testament? Those that trust in the Lamb. We just happen to know his name. His name's Jesus. But they had faith in the Lamb to come. They were sacrificing lambs symbolically pointing to Jesus, right? They had faith in the Lamb to come. We have faith in the Lamb that came, but salvation is through the Lamb. That Jesus took the judgment instead of us taking the judgment.
So Israel-Iran war right now, what's the distraction?
From what I understand, Iran was very close to getting nuclear weapons. And they have said many times that they want to get rid of the little Satan and the big Satan. And they consider Israel the little Satan and America the big Satan. So it's, Russia, other countries, they have nuclear weapons. But I had somebody explain, especially during the Soviet era, that communists did not believe in God, and they were not afraid to die, but they weren't in a hurry to die either. The Islamists think that they're in a hurry because they think if I can kill a bunch of infidels, I will go to paradise and have 72 virgins and a big sex party. I mean, that's a motivation, right? And so
for some,
yeah,
72 women to pleasure. Oh wow.
Yeah, it's. I mean. So,
a lot of work.
So what happens, in Islam, especially, people forget the KGB founded the PLO. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was founded by the Soviet Union in 1964, I think. And so the goal of it is to sow division. So that critical race theory where they go into a country, observe the groups, and they sow division against groups, they started, so the Soviets helped start ELN in Bolivia to sow division to overthrow the country. They helped start FARC in Colombia to overthrow the country. And they went into, Cuba and got behind Castro to overthrow, Jean Baptiste. And so they went into the Congo. And so but they did it in Israel, right? They created the PLO. So the PLO is this toxic mix of Islamic jihad views mixed with Soviet division tactics. And anyway.
But why would the Soviets care about Israel and Palestine?
To keep it from siding with America. They do not want the Middle East to side with America, so they want to sow this division.
So destruction of this war right now is what?
Well,
implementation of AI on the worldwide level? Well,
I was given a little bit of the history. The Soviet Union fell, but so my view anyway is that Russia does not have the global aspirations like it did when it was the Soviet Union. It's more or less, yes, it's totalitarian, but it's almost like they would be content to be left alone. China has global aspirations. And so China has been strategically buying up land. And they do the bribe or the bullet. It was China's Silk Road Initiative, where they'll go into these countries and say, hey, if you do business with us, we'll pay off all these politicians with money. But if you don't do business with us, well, bad things will happen, right? They'll go into Africa. They want rare earth metals from these different countries. They go into South America, the Panama Canal. I mean, what's China doing down there in the Panama Canal? I mean, so they're taking over strategic spots around the world. China is the oldest civilization on the planet, right? All the way back to the Yellow Emperor in, 2000 BC, and they've had a continuous culture, so they do have a strategic global aspirations. I think they're part of the globalist thing, but then you have the financial group, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. These are asset management companies controlling trillions and trillions of dollars, and they're pro-China and.
Do you think, I'm sorry for interrupting you, do you think China is still mad at the Western world for the Opium Wars? They want to retaliate somehow?
Yeah.
That was an embarrassment, right, for China?
It was their century of humiliation.
Big time.
Yeah, so Britain traded with China for porcelain plates, which we call China.
Yes.
And Britain would buy it with gold until the British were depleting their gold supply. And they said, well, let's...
But only porcelain, not tea?
Yeah, tea as well. But what they did was they decided to grow opium in India and then ship the opium into China in exchange for the porcelain and the tea. And that way they could keep their gold in England. And so the Chinese did not want the opium. And
Crazy people.
Pardon?
Crazy people. How can you not want heroin?
Yeah.
Opium, wow.
And so the emperor hired somebody as a administrator, and he confiscated all of the opium from the British and burnt it all. And because they had opium dens, and even the emperor's own staff, everybody was like doped out on opium, and the country was weakened. And so they confiscate this opium. The British go to Queen Victoria and say, hey, the Chinese are taking our stuff, and that they approve the British Navy to come. And the Chinese had a pretty good army, but they didn't have a navy. And the British win, and then it happens a second time, and they win more, and then they force tons and tons and tons of opium into China, and it's called the Century of Humiliation. And the British found a bank in Hong Kong called the Hong Kong Singapore Bank, or HSBC, for drug money laundering, right? Laundering drug money. So they take this opium money, they put it in HSBC Bank. And it was a big deal in the 1980s because HSBC, you'd have Colombian drug lords would sell the drugs, and they would take the boxes of cash and put it into the local HSBC bank. And then you could be in America and you could withdraw the funds, and it would be laundered money. And they almost got to the place where they shut down this bank, but under Clinton, they said, well, there's so many good people that have jobs will lose their jobs, and they'll lose their savings, and so let's go ahead and just sort of give HSBC a little slap on the hand. But it's, you can watch the YouTube videos on it. I mean, but you had these globalists that are working the chessboard, but there is a percentage of them that want a global government. And with AI, with all the technology, they feel like it's within their grasp. They just need a few more crises to get people to surrender more of their freedom. And the COVID was a perfect example of that.
Do you think that was a failure from their side, or they think that was success?
Well, the way it works is they do something. It's like that triangle of Hagel. They push, and then they know at some point people are not going to go anymore, and then they come up and say, well, we'll just settle for half as bad. And it's like, oh, man, so I'm relieved it's not. But then they wait and do another cycle of it, and then they'll go push, and then they to the limit until people say, I've had enough, and then the people settle for. So they go back and strategize and say, okay, how can we do it better next time? And so if you noticed, like before COVID, you had globalists and Bill Gates and others in New York or one of those cities where they planned 2 years before COVID, what if there was a international pandemic, and what would be the response, and this and that. And they basically, it looks like they planned, because the response was exactly what they had planned in the meeting.
Coincidence.
And then another one was, after that, you had Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum, and some others, and they planned, what if there was a international internet blackout? And so the thought is, well, gee, are they planning that next? And if you've noticed, Spain has a blackout, other countries has a blackout, and it's like, are they testing the waters? And if you think of it, if there was, and they say now with AI that there is no security, that they literally can hack everything. So it's tenuous. And that's why I think, in my own personal view, Trump is not a globalist. He's a Make America Great Again. He is more or less the last chance to stop the globalist movement. And because if he was no longer there, what would happen? Well, you probably have politicians in America going to the rich guys saying, give me money so I can get elected. And it would embolden Russia. It would embolden Xi Jinping in China. It would embolden, North Korea. It would embolden the Ayatollah. You basically go back to gang war. It would be a gang war on a global scale with the most up-to-date weapons and tracking technology.
But you want to tell me that they wanted to kill him and they didn't succeed?
Yeah.
They couldn't do it.
It was a miracle.
Really?
Yeah.
And only, let's say, 2 attempts, at least that we know of.
Yeah. You think of, so from God's point of view, he created us for fellowship. And before the flood, according to the Bible, people were living centuries. Mm-hmm. And right before the Midrash, which is the Jewish oral tradition, says that one planting would produce enough food for 40 years. I mean, if they're living centuries, you had to have enough food, and you had to have pretty good health. But what do people do when they have lots of food and lots of health? They end up fighting with each other. And it says that before the flood, the thoughts of man were on evil continually. Mm-hmm. And they chose not to retain God in their thoughts, and it repented God that he even made man. Mm-hmm. One translation says it broke God's heart. It's like, I made these people for fellowship, and people structured their lives so they could go days, weeks, months, centuries without thinking about God. Could you imagine the Holy Spirit in front of somebody's face for a century trying to get their attention? Like, I got this pattern, I don't think. And so after the flood, God said, we're going to do plan B. Plan B is, it says he gives us over to our own devices, he hides his face, and we go through tough times and we turn to him out of desperation. So he created us to fellowship with him. And it's like if plan A, if blessings don't turn people to God, then there's the plan B. I'm going to let you go through some trials. And we turn to God in desperation. And think about yourself. Do we tend to pray more when everything's fine or when we go through a crisis? Even we should pray all the time in fellowship with God, but human nature is such when we have the crisis, that's when we really turn to the Lord. But his goal is to have us turn to him. And some people, instead of turning, they harden their heart, they get bitter, they blame him, and then they make their choice. I'm going to go the other way, right? Because if you're God and you want to populate heaven, wouldn't you want to populate it with people who wanted to be around you?
Mm-hmm.
Which means you had to give them the choice of not being around you for the choice to love you and be around, to be the choice. Our life on earth is sort of like this experiment greenhouse where we have the choice. And we choose, do we want to be around God? Do we not? Anyway, so every generation has a crisis. Attila the Hun had an army of 500,000 men wiping out cities in Europe. Genghis Khan kills 30 million people from Korea to Hungary to Russia. The bubonic plague, the Spanish flu. I mean, every generation has a crisis that's really bad. And what happens in the crises? Some people turn to Christ and they step up and they say, okay, God, here I am, use me. There's a bunch of needs and you go out and you take care of them. And other people end up hating God and turning and worrying about selfish stuff rather than other people. And so it's sort of a mini self-sorting out of the sheep and the goats. It's not the end times one, right? When, Lord, did we take care of you? When I was sick and you doctored me and fed me and clothed me and whatever you do to the least of these my brethren, you've done unto me. And so when we realize that we're free will creatures, and it's almost like God is saying, okay, we're getting close to the end. We're the bride of Christ. The church is the bride of Christ. And every romance novel builds up to a key part in the movie, a forsaking of all others and choosing the one.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Maybe the girl's got a couple guys dating her and she's like, oh, is it this one? And then it's the big night. She's got her dress. And she's all ready, did her hair. It's like going to be a dance. She's all excited. And the guy calls at the last minute and says, oh, I got this job and I got to miss it. You'll understand, won't you? And then there's this other guy that'll crawl across glass just to spend a few minutes with her. She goes, you know what? This crisis moment reveals to me that this guy really doesn't love me and this guy does. And I think God puts the world time after time after time, but we're getting close to the end time where there's crisis moments and people make a choice that they would rather not want to be doing what God is. In other words, like, hey, God, I'm going to surrender my will to you. I'm going to do what you want. And I think we're getting close to the end because God is letting the evil be exposed in a way that I've never seen before. I mean, we had, stories of Satan clubs on elementary school campuses, Satan worshiping Grammys, Satan trans clothes designers for Target. Iowa State.
Never ever before.
Yeah.
Like never.
Iowa State Capitol had a Satan statue in it. And it's like, I've never seen this before. And God's like, okay, it's like The Wizard of Oz, that movie, and at the end there's this dog, Toto, that pulls back the curtain. You see this, I'm the great Oz, and it's an old man at a microphone. You're not scared of him anymore. And God's like, okay, we're getting close to the end. You're not a robot. You're a free will being, but I need you to hurry up and make your decision. So I'm going to pull back the curtain. God, devil, choose. And some people are going to choose the all others. They're going to want to be liked and friended and followed, and they're going to say, okay, I'll accept this behavior if it means people will think nice of me, and I'll accept this next behavior until pretty soon, okay, I'll accept Satan, because they're drug along because they want to. And then others are saying, I'm sorry, I draw the line here. I'm not going to be quiet when they want to mutilate and do a hysterectomy on an 8-year-old girl because she went through a tomboy phase. I'm not going to want to castrate a little boy because he played with his sister's Barbie doll. and they cut the rubber band and it snaps. And I think God is pushing the world to a point in the movie where you have to make a decision, and so this is separating. And so people are revealing in the time of crises what they really believe and whose side they're on. And anyway, I know I've sort of talked history and I've sort of talked, theology type stuff, but
it's all aligning. So in 2020 was one of those cycles, right? We had the COVID for two years, let's say. Prior to that, during COVID, there was a summer of love with the BLM. You think we're in that new cycle right now with the LA riots, Israel and Iran?
Yeah, well,
Russia,
actually,
Ukraine.
It goes back to Occupy Wall Street.
2008?
Yeah, so you go back, and there was this movement across America where they set up homeless tents in city parks all across the country. And then the next iteration was the George Floyd riots in the cities. The next iteration was Seattle, with autonomous zones where they literally took over the downtown for weeks, and Portland, Oregon, and other places. Well, what's the next iteration? I mean, I think they would love to have actual violence and killing in cities across the country, so that everybody would say, government, come in, restore order. And the government says, okay, we'll do it. But I think that people have been praying, and God has been putting off that because we repented. And I think it was a miracle that Trump got elected. I think it was a miracle that he didn't get his head blown apart, right? And I think that it's in response. Caesar wanted to have a worldwide tracking system. I mean, here's the most powerful guy in the world wanting to have everybody be counted. And it was that census that caused Joseph and Mary to leave Nazareth and go to Bethlehem, where the prophecies said that Jesus would be born. Mm-hmm. So behind, the devil thinks, I'm going to get control, but God's behind it saying, no, I'm fulfilling my plan.
You're actually part of the plan.
I think of the devil tried to tempt Jesus, and Jesus said, it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. And so the devil couldn't tempt him. So the devil's like, I'm going to kill him. And so he gets the Jews and the Gentiles, right? So the Jews, there was this short period in Israel's history where the Romans took control and did not allow the Jews to carry out capital punishment. And so the Jews are occupied by the Romans, and they want to kill Jesus, but they can't so they take Jesus to the Gentiles. And then the Romans kill Jesus. So you have the devil saying, I'm going to get the Jews, I'm going to get the Gentiles, we're going to kill Jesus. And Jesus is on the cross and he says, it is finished. And the devil's like, what's finished? He got the Jews and the Gentiles to sacrifice the Lamb of God so that the sins of the world would be put upon Jesus, and he would pay for the sins of the world, so that anybody that believes in Jesus could approach an all-just God and not have to be judged by this all-just God, because Jesus took the judgment in our place and we're approaching him through Jesus. The devil got his job. He loses his job. What's the name Satan? It means accuser of the brethren. So the devil, the devil's before God, and he accuses us to God. And he says, this person sinned. You're a just God. You got to judge him. And if you don't judge them by your silence, you're actually giving consent to their sin. And if you give consent to sin, you're no longer a just God. And so the devil accuses us to God. And like the book of Job, the devil goes before God and says, well, the reason Job's being so nice is because you're playing favorites. Mm-hmm. You're blessing him extra special. Anybody would be good if they're blessed extra special. So you're not really a fair God. You're an unjust God because you're... And God's like, nope, I'm not playing extra favorites, right? Have at him, right? But the devil is accusing and says, okay, Bill sinned or whoever sinned. And God, if you're a just God, you got to judge them, because if you don't judge their sin, your silence is giving consent to the sin. It's called the rule of tacit admission, TACIT. And it's in our Constitution, right? Article 1, Section 7. Congress puts a bill on the president's desk, And it says, if any bill shall not be signed by the president within 10 days, the same shall be a law in like manner as if he had signed it. So his silence equals his signature. It's in real estate law. You buy a rent house for some retirement income and a squatter moves in. And if you know about it and you're silent, they can gain title to your rent house through adverse possession. They can say, well, you know about it. You didn't try to evict him. I talked to a farmer, and he had a neighbor had a road that went across his property to get to the main road. And they were friends, so it was no problem. Well, the neighbor dies, and methamphetamine dealers buy it. And they're having traffic all day and night. And this guy tries to stop him. And they said, no, man, we've been using this road. We're going to continue. He goes down to the courthouse, and they say, yes, it's the law. If you let somebody drive across your land for 20 years, they get permanent access.
That's the law.
And so it was 19 years. He had quickly filed the paperwork, and they were able to stop it and put up the fence saying, sorry, no more access. It's in trademark law. You design a trademark. Somebody copies it, and it's all over the internet. If you do not try to defend your trademark, they all get to use it. Your silence gives consent. And so if there are sins and God is silent and not judging the sin, by default, he would be giving consent to the sin. And if God gives consent to sin, he's denying his just nature. He's denying himself. So he has to judge the sin. But the gospel is Jesus took the judgment in our place. So God can maintain that he's a just God, but he's a loving God, that he provided Jesus. And Jesus, out of love for the Father and you and me, was willing to become the Lamb and take the judgment in our place so that we can approach this all just God and not have to worry about being judged. The Lamb is God's way to love you without having to judge you. It's his plan to get around his own just nature so he can maintain that he's just and not have to change that he judged every sin, but he's love and that he provided the Lamb to take the judgment. And so Satan is constantly accusing us to God, but once Jesus died on the cross, he lost his job. In other words, he says, God, they sinned, and you got to judge them. And God said, I did judge them in Christ, and they're approaching me through Christ. So they took the judgment on it. So they've already been judged. And the devil's like, but. He goes, no buts. They're approaching me through Christ. They've already paid for their sin. And it says the accuser of the brethren was cast down. Right? It's like, so now he's just waiting till he gets judged, and
what do you think is the end game, not to take into the consideration the revelations, right? The end times. So the end game of, let's say, our generations. Will the technocracy be ruling over people, or do you think we are about to make some kind of a digital revolution that we're gonna neglect or deny the new technologies?
Yeah, I think historically, every advancement in technology is a two-edged sword. It can be used for bad or good. And so you look at the printing press. They were able to print the Bible with it, but they could also print pornography with it. Propaganda with it, and lies. And so I think we have this advancement in technology with AI. But if we repent and turn to the Lord, he could, who knows, develop a superior AI that can spot the fake AI and can neutralize it and cancel it out. I mean, I don't know, but that might be a possibility. But it from God's point of view, he always wants to push it to this crisis moment to get us to respond. And so historically, God likes to wait until things look hopeless. And then he raises up little nobodies who are small in their own eyes, but big in faith and courage. I mean, here's Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, with his chariots and swords. And here's Moses, an old 80-year-old man with a stick and no weapons. And God rolls up his sleeve and he says, watch this. Right? He loves to show himself strong on behalf of those who are trusting in him.
Yeah, but this was thousands of years ago. Give me an example, let's say 100 or 200 years ago that happened, or even maybe a decade ago. Maybe there were some examples that I don't even think of.
Yeah, so my wife and I wrote some books called Miracles in American History, and it's filled full of stories just like you mentioned. So you have, Lincoln, Civil War. The Confederates are winning, and Lincoln has a day of fasting and prayer, a national proclamation to be observed on April 30th, 1863. 2 days later, the Confederates shoot their own best general. Like what? Yes, the Battle of Chancellorsville. The Confederates are outnumbered 2-1, and they're winning. Stonewall Jackson is such a great general, but he's coming back at twilight, and in the dim light, his own Confederate men say, "Stop, who goes there?" And before he can answer, they let off a volley of shots, hit him twice in the arm, once in the hand, kill his horse. He's lying on the ground all mangled, and he gets his arm amputated and dies 2 weeks later. And about every Civil War historian will say, if Stonewall Jackson had been at Gettysburg 2 months later, the South probably would have won. But this was 2 days after Lincoln's day of fasting and prayer. And, you have World War II. Patton has the Third Army, and he's coming to the rescue of the 101st Airborne that's at Bastogne, right there in Belgium, and it's the Battle of the Bulge. So the D-Day, Normandy, the Allies land and push the Nazis back, and they're running out of gas, so the Nazis make this blitzkrieg to try to, and if you look at a map, it bulges on the map, right? Because they want to get to Antwerp, Belgium, to the port to get gas. Mm-hmm. And so they do this really fast, but there's this one town of Bastogne where 8 roads come together, and you have to get past that to get to Antwerp. And there's the 101st Airborne. These guys were parachuted in only to land and realize they're completely surrounded. And the Nazi commander says, "You're surrounded, surrender." And he gave a one-word answer, "Nuts." And so it's freezing cold. They can't even get the shovel in the ground to dig a foxhole. They're down to rationing 8 bullets a day per soldier. And coming to their rescue is General Patton, but he can't march because the planes can't fly to give him cover because it's snowy and wet and rainy and freezing. And he gets his chaplain, James O'Neill, to compose a prayer to God to have the weather clear. And the chaplain's like, "Well, I don't know if I can do that, sir." He goes, "That's an order, do it." And so this chaplain writes this prayer. "Almighty Heavenly Father, we beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains. Hearken to us as men and soldiers who call upon thee. Establish thy justice among men and nations." They printed on 250,000 index cards. The flip side is Patton's Christmas greeting to his troops, and they all pray it. The next day, the sky clears. The planes fly, they bomb the Nazi artillery, the soldiers march, and they come to the rescue of Bastogne, and the Nazis run out of gas. And the tanks are abandoned in the fields, and then 2 months later, they're surrounded in Berlin, and they get defeated.
Okay, William, so answer me then this question. So when we read the Old Testament, we read about all those miracles, right? Something extraterrestrial or something kind of a magic, right?
Yeah.
Why doesn't this magic happen now? Why, let's say, no magic in the New Testament, except the resurrection and the demons and etc.?
Well, I mean, it's there. The Apostle Paul, somebody was withstanding him, and he said, "You're going to be blind for a while until you repent." And the guy was struck blind right in front of the king, right? And but Israel during the 6-day war, I talked to soldiers who had fought, and they said there was this minefield that they had to cross at nighttime under fire from the enemy, and they would be there, and they would hear a voice over there saying, over here. And so they would all get up and they'd go over there. And then they hear a voice over here. And they would follow this, and they get to the other side, and they win the battle. The next day they looked. They just avoided all of these landmines like supernaturally. There was Gamal Nasser, president of Egypt, Egyptian Air Force, getting ready to fly and bomb Israel. And Israel was planning on attacking. But they didn't know that a famous belly dancer was going to perform, and all of the generals in Egypt went to this belly dance party and stayed up all night. The next morning is when the Israeli jets come and bomb the Egyptian airfields and destroy all their jets. And the Egyptian soldiers are calling their generals like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And there's no generals picking up the phone. I mean, who would have timed it? I mean, the Israelis didn't know that there's going to be this belly dancer day. The stories are there. You just have to look under the surface a little bit because they're not going to be announced on the nightly news. Now, CBN, all right, Christian Broadcasting Network, they'll broadcast some of these stories. And but I talked to a friend of mine. He is a pastor in Norfolk, Virginia, and he is a Pastor Victor Vysorsky, and he's was from Russia and in the Ukraine area. I don't know exactly the area, but his dad was went to a palm reader, and told them all this stuff, and all the stuff was coming true, just like this palm reader was telling him. And it was during the fighting the Nazis, and they were in a dugout, and he heard a voice that said, "Get out of this dugout." And as soon as he gets out, a bomb goes in there and kills everybody. And that's when he started to turn to Jesus. And he says the moment he turned to Jesus, all of the palm reader stuff stopped happening. No more things that they were told happened. And instead he starts going to their little underground church. And they would, and so the Christian kids, he said, were persecuted in school. And the other kids, when they became good communists, they would get a little badge on their arm, and they were called Lenin's Devils. But the Christian kids couldn't get that little badge, and they would put a Bible on there, and then have everybody kick it and spit on it. And these Christian kids wouldn't, so they'd get persecuted. And then he said that they would print their own Bibles in their house, and one of them would make the little cardboard covers for the Bible, and the other one would assemble the pages, and then they would. But he says that they would hide it in little secret places in their house. And so everybody had a secret place. A floorboard would be loose or whatever, or a molding in the ceiling or a ceiling panel. And but one day the Soviets went to all the Christians' houses at the same time, so they couldn't warn each other. And they went to his house, and he said that they felt around the attic and they found these. He says, these the cardboard covers that were going to be for the Bible, and they said to the mom, "What is this? What is this?" And she goes, "Oh, the kids playing cards. They like to play games with them. And they're like, and they let her off the hook. But he's filled full of stories like this, and the one guy, Ben and Rita Grace, they became missionaries to the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and Ben his dad is a doctor and was a doctor. He passed away now, but his dad was a doctor and had all these medical stamps, and official looking things. And so Ben had gotten saved, and he was sort of radical for Jesus. And he typed out, this letter gives permission for this person to go anywhere in Russia. This is approved by such and such agency, which is higher than all the other agencies. And he says there were so many secret agencies in Russia that not everybody knew all the other secret agencies. And so they thought, and he put all these stamps on it. right? One of the, and he said that he had a stack of them. And he says they went across the border from Sweden into Russia, or
Finland.
Into Russia, and they had Bibles on their buses, and that the communists get on the bus and they walk and they like miraculously get through there, and they would like go through town, and they would get. He says to go from one city to the other, you needed a passport. You couldn't just drive from one city to the other during the Soviet era, but he would drive and they'd stop his car and he'd pull out one of these letters. And they would like look through it, they'd call somebody and they'd look through it and they wouldn't know, is this some secret department we don't know? And so they would just give it back to him and let him go on. And he says, and they would go into towns and just start preaching. And he says it was like the last couple of years before the Berlin Wall fell. And so there was like sort of a confusion that was going on in Russia. And so they took advantage of it. But you read these stories and these are like, he says they had a house that was right across the street from a military base. And the house was filled full of Bibles. It was like so close that they didn't suspect it. And he says they would go and fill up their car with Bibles and they would go around and it's quite an amazing story. I actually did a couple TV shows with him for the TCT television network years ago. And he brought all these things and he was, naming names and showing places that he had been into. So I think God still does miracles. It just doesn't make the mainstream news. And I think that it's always going to be a place where you have to have faith. In other words, if you had electrical nodes, positive, negative, and there's an arc of electricity that goes back and forth, well, think of that arc as faith. And he can get the evidence really convincing, but he's never going to have it be totally convincing, because then it wouldn't take faith. And without faith, it's impossible to please God. There always is going to be this little element of, was that a coincidence? Was that, and that's intentional, because it takes that last step of faith. And again, it's without faith, it's impossible to please God. Jesus wanted to do mighty miracles in his hometown, but they didn't have faith, right? So there'll be proofs, but there'll always be enough space for somebody to say, oh, well, that was just a coincidence, But when you see it from a God perspective, it's like, wait a second, too many of these coincidences line up.
Would you say the Cuban crisis is one of those miracles? When they almost, both of them pushed the button?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, and there's a number of instances in Israel where I think, throughout history, they could have broke into a war. And I don't know how long you want to talk for.
As much as you have time.
Oh, okay. But I know I'm sort of going from history stuff to spiritual stuff, but people say God knows the future, but in a sense He knows all the possible futures, and He tells you what they are, and He lets you choose. Right? Deuteronomy 28. If you hearken to the voice of the Lord, this will be your future. You'll be blessed coming in, blessed coming out, head and out the tail. But if you don't hearken to the voice of the Lord, this will be your future. Diseases of Egypt will come upon you. The enemy will come in amongst you, rise up above you, and they'll be the head and you'll be the tail. Right? Jeremiah, the prophet, goes to King Zedekiah and says, if you surrender to Babylon, Jerusalem will be spared. If you don't surrender to Babylon, Jerusalem will be burnt to the ground. Right? So he tells you which route, right? It's like a GPS on your phone. You can get, it's going to get to that end day's destination,
yes,
but it might take a different route to get there. And so God knows all the possible futures. He tells you what they are. He lets you choose, and He's smart enough to know how you're going to choose. But He still has to let you choose, because if He were to judge somebody before they sinned, He would be unjust for judging somebody who hadn't sinned yet. So He has to let you, even though He knows how you're going to choose, He has to let you do the choosing. And if He were to stop you from making a bad choice, He would have to stop everybody from making a bad choice, to be fair, even Adam, and we'd be back robots in the garden. And so He knows the future. He knows how you're going to choose, and He knows how He's going to respond to how you choose. and he knows how you're going to respond to how he responds, and he knows how he's going to respond, right? But he still has to let it play out. So he tells Moses, the children of Israel are going to go into the promised land, and they're going to end up worshiping the gods of the other nations. And I know it, and I know I'm going to get really upset at them, and in my anger, I am going to drive them out of the land. But I know that in captivity, they're going to repent, and I know that I'm going to have mercy on them, and I'm going to bring them back to the land, right? He knew it, but he still has to let it play out. Because if he were to stop somebody from sinning before they sinned, he would be unjust for judging somebody before they did something wrong. And if he were going to stop one person from sinning against him, to be fair, he would have to stop everybody from sinning against him, which means he'd take away our free will, and we'd be back to being naked in the garden.
Yeah, but at the same time, then we have this moral dilemma. Let's say, for instance, we know what happened with Hitler, right, with the Holocaust and the World War II, etc. Let's say we have a time machine, and we can go back, let's say, 1910, 1905, 1900, and we can meet a little Hitler, right? And we know that what he's capable of doing in the future. So the moral dilemma is, if we can do it, should we kill him or not? So if God knows everything that is going to happen, good or bad, and he can stop it, but he still gives us this free will, then we still get to this new AI technology, like the Minority Report. From all the data that I've been doing this podcast, let's say you've been doing interviews, writing the books, it says that in 5 years, you're going to make an insurrection. So should we prevent it, and should we jail Bill Federer now, or should we wait till he does the crime? So this is the dilemma.
Yeah, well, the limitation, and I don't even like to use the word limitation, but the one thing is God is just, and he cannot deny his just nature. So everything that he does, it has to be just. And so he has to allow people, he cannot judge people before they do something wrong. Again, if he did, then he'd be taking away their free will, and he'd be unjust for judging somebody that didn't do anything wrong yet, right? And but Jesus, died on the cross so that we've done unjust stuff, but we're approaching God through Christ. And so Jesus took the judgment in our place. But it makes no sense until you realize the end goal is God wanting to have people turn to him. And that without realizing that God has an eternal plan, then our lives make no sense.
Okay, but from a human perspective, let's take us, humanity. Should we prevent the crime and jail somebody 1 day before or 1 year before he commits, that is upon our data, before he commits the crime?
I don't exactly know the answer to that. I think that's why we have prisons, because we think somebody might go out and commit a crime based on their past behavior, and so we're going to put them in prison. That's why a lot of times they want life sentence rather than killing somebody. But that is something where, say, your past behavior shows that if we leave this guy with little kids, he's going to abuse them. So he's done it lots and lots of times. So let's keep him in jail.
Let's say he didn't do anything to kids, but he was watching pornography, right? He got caught watching kids' pornography. Should we jail him prior to him touching a kid?
Well, that's why we have pornography laws. There are laws that say that.
Okay, let's say somebody is watching YouTube videos on YouTube or on Darknet how to make a bomb, and we know it. Jail him? He didn't commit any crime till today. Yet.
I don't know if I know the answer to that.
I believe this is the biggest question in the next decade. Since AI is so powerful, they can predict our behavior. It
can, to a certain degree. they've found AI makes lots of mistakes.
Do you remember AI 5 years ago? It was nothing.
Yeah.
And AI right now, it makes videos. Okay, 20 seconds long, but they're very, very realistic. So in 5 to 10 years, AI is going to blow our minds.
Yeah, I agree. But still, I think they call them large language models, and it goes out there and it gets all the information and brings it in. But somebody programs it and says, okay, do not go to these conservative websites to gather information to compile your answer. So the AI is actually using possibly false assumptions.
Correct.
And so it can be...
It's who controls the AI.
Yeah. So you have somebody used Atari, which is that old-fashioned ping-pong game, and they put it up to AI to play chess, and the Atari beat the AI. And they said, wait a second, maybe AI is not as flawless as we think. But when you study history, there's always an advancement, and then it's matched by the other side. So one of the interesting studies is weapons. So the first invention ever was the plow. Cain was a tiller of the soil. And then the plow turned into a weapon, and people started killing each other with them, and people gravitated together for protection, and it turned into cities. But then you had the invention of the bow, the bow and arrow, invention of the sailboat, and then you had bronze weapons, and then you had iron weapons, and then you had big long phalanx spears that the Greeks had, right? And then you had the scimitar sword that the Muslims invented, right? The Damascus steel. It was really light, so they could hold the reins of the horse in one hand, the sword in the other, and cut somebody in half at a full gallop. Then you had the gunpowder. The Chinese, or actually the Mongols, invented a composite bow. So the English had the English long bow, but it was like 6 feet tall. So you had to sort of use it stationary. Well, the composite bow has that recurve in it, and it's a third of the size, but it could shoot 300 yards. And so the Mongols could be riding on horseback with this bow, right? And so they conquered, but then when Genghis Khan died, they took a year off for a big funeral. They diverted a river. They buried him in the river, diverted the river back, and then killed everybody that was part of the funeral procession. So nobody to this day knows where Genghis Khan is buried. But when the Mongols get back to fighting, by that time, other countries learned how to make a composite bow, and the Mongols couldn't get the ball rolling again. The stirrup for riding horses, it was before the stirrup, in Mongolia, they would ride with a little short horses, and they would tie a rope around the horse and leave 2 loops hanging for your big toes because they would ride barefoot. And that made its way to India, and they made the loops bigger, and then across the China, the Silk Road to Persia, and they made them out of leather with metal. And so now you had the complete power of a galloping horse behind the sword. And they conquered all the Middle East, all of North Africa, all into Spain, and then they conquered around Tours, France. And they're stopped by Charles Martel. Well, Charles Martel gets all the horses, learns how to make a stirrup, teaches his men how to fight on horseback, and 5 years later, they win their first battle against the Muslims. And it takes 700 years. So each time there's a technological advancement until the other side catches up. And then another technological advancement and the other side catches up. And another one. And then it turns into information warfare. But the one side, and then the other side catches up. And so I think that the stakes are getting higher. It is taking more of a global dimension that it's never, ever had before. So I do think we're getting close to the climax of this. But I do think that God is a creator God. And when we seek him, he can release ideas that can thwart whatever the bad idea is. And so who knows, but somebody can invent something that can, use AI to shield you from them studying your profile. And maybe they can use AI to get into AI and corrupt all the profiles. So now they're not going to know, and that's one of the problems with AI, because it's just going out there and gathering the information. But if it's gathering from incorrect information, it's going to assemble an answer that's incorrect. I mean, I had somebody say that they asked AI about Abraham Lincoln, and it says, well, Abraham Lincoln didn't believe in God, and he was an atheist. I was like, I read through all of Abraham Lincoln's proclamations of prayer, proclamations of fasting, talking about God, talking about the Creator, talking about, Jesus in his second inaugural address is chiseled in stone on the Lincoln Memorial. He says, both sides read the same Bible, pray to the same God. The prayers of both could not be answered. And indeed, he says, but if 200 years of unrequited toil by the slaves is repaid by the sword, let it be said, the judgments of the Lord are altogether true and righteous. And here he is quoting scripture. And how can the AI say, oh, he didn't believe in God, when here he is quoting scripture?
Because it was fed with the wrong information.
Yeah, the AI was fed because it went out and looked at all the liberal websites. And it assembled this liberal. So if the databases get so corrupt, people are going to say, well, you can't really trust AI. I've seen AI pictures and they look really realistic until you look really close and there's 6 fingers on a hand. It's like, wait a second.
Yeah, but that was a year ago. Right now, it doesn't make those mistakes anymore.
Yeah, but you could use AI to spot AI, right? You could say, is this paper so perfect that it was computer AI generated versus human? It's like a diamond. They can artificially make a diamond, but the problem is it's too perfect. So they know it's fake because it's too perfect. Because a natural occurring diamond will have little microscopic impurities that occur in nature. And so I don't know the answer to that, but I do know God. And whatever the devil does, God is one up because he's the creator. The devil's the perverter, right? The devil is an imitator and a perverter. He's not a creator. The devil does not know everything. God knows everything. God's outside of time. The devil is stuck in time. When the devil was cast out of heaven and cast to earth, he was thrown from an eternal realm to a time-controlled realm, which means we are moving in slow motion compared to God. Right? I liken it to, God created light. And light is a photon, which is a perpendicular wave in the electromagnetic field that travels at 186,000 miles per second. And Einstein's theory of relativity is the closer you can travel approaching the speed of light, for you, time would slow down. And if you could travel the speed of light, for you, time would stand still. Well, God created light, so he's faster than light. So for God, time stands still. Right? He's infinite mass. He's infinite power. He's all right. But we'll never comprehend the time standing still part. But the closest we can get is a scripture that says, a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. Imagine experiencing one day as if it was 1,000 years. In other words, we are living in slow motion compared to God.
Well, to be honest, God didn't create the light. He said, let there be light. God created heavens and earth. But it
says there was darkness,
and he said,
and then God said, "Let there be light." Right, and so him saying that created light. Before he said that, there was no light. After he said it, there was light. And with the Hadron Particle Collider, they can fire photons at each other, and it creates positrons and the antimatter, whatever, but the positron is the smallest thing that they would consider matter. So you have light creating matter.
Basically playing God.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is when God said, let there be light, he created the building block out of which he was able to bring matter, right? So, but anyway, the point I was getting at is that God he created light, so he's faster than light. So for God, time stands still. Time is moving because Jesus is the first and the last, beginning and the end, Alpha and the Omega. And even the devil said, have you come to torment us before the time? So they knew that this river's headed toward a waterfall and they're going to go down to hell. But time is moving, but God's outside of time. So Why is this important? We make our little free will decisions in time, but we're moving so slow, God can readjust every electron in the universe before he lets time move forward to the next nano frame. So it's our free will in the context of his unlimited sovereign will, and it works because he's outside of time. And so this idea is that we think of, things are going to hurry up. From God's point of view, he's not in a hurry, and his goal is to have people be put into a position where they either choose and seek him or they reject him. And he's fair. He's letting them make the choice, And
speaking of CERN, the Great Collider, would you consider it as the new Tower of Babel?
I mean, I think there may be an element in it. I saw some dedication ceremony.
Oh, wow.
That looks
Spooky.
pretty demonic, But in Strasbourg, over there in Europe, they have one of the, EU buildings, but it looks like the unfinished Tower of Babel. Mm-hmm. And in front of it is a woman riding a beast. Right, this bronze statue was like, gee, that sort of sounds like Revelation.
Yeah,
right?
it's like it's written in the Revelation.
Yeah. So if you can Google it and see the statue, there's this woman riding the beast, and so it's a whether it is the final thing, I don't know, but I do think we're moving closer and closer. So I like inside of every cell in your body is the DNA for your entire body. Every cell has the DNA instructions for your entire body. And so if you look back at time and you look at all the different instances in time, if you study it, each one of those periods sort of can give you an insight into the all of time. So we go back to Nimrod, Tower of Babel, just down the hill from Mount Ararat where Noah's Ark lands, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And this is where most archaeologists, anthropologists, etymologists that study the spread of languages, they say this is where civilization began. And Nimrod wanted to build his tower there and control it. And so he made, the Jewish commentator Josephus said Nimrod wanted to build his tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. And he made everybody in town bake bricks and bring them, or he would kill them. So he's defiant against God, oppressive over man. And since the whole world is there, he wants to control the population of the world. So in a sense, Nimrod was the first globalist. Mm-hmm. He was the first one world government guy. Population of the world's there. He wants to control it through fear. And God comes down and confuses the languages, and the people scatter into language groups that turn into nations. Lo and behold, nations were God's invention to postpone a one world government. Take the population of the world, break it into different languages, they'll all scatter. But every generation has some king or pharaoh or Caesar or Kaiser Khan that wants to conquer other nations and control the world again, but they die off. So in that sense, death is a blessing, because the devil's like, okay, I got to get somebody else that's ambitious enough to, right? And but the next one that comes along has the more improved weapons to use, so these kingdoms gradually get bigger. You have the first one, Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and then Sargon of Akkadian, and then, 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs, and 5,000 years Chinese emperors, and then king of Assyria, king of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Cyrus of Persia, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar. These kingdoms keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Anybody that can plot on a graph sees that at some point this is going to max out on a global level. And Jesus said, wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. And each generation goes through a crisis. It's a time to reveal what's inside of the people's hearts. Are they going to care about others or just care about themselves, right? And but at some point, it's going to max out. And whether this is the generation, I don't know. I do think that people say, I wonder what God's going to do. My answer is maybe God's watching us to decide what he's going to do. If we repent, he'll put it off. And a Bible example. Manasseh was a wicked king in Jerusalem, sacrificing children to Moloch, The prophets come to him and says, you are filling the streets of Jerusalem with the blood of these innocent kids. You're doing the same thing that the pagans that were here before Israel came in were doing. I brought Israel in to drive them out because I'm going to drive you out. So here you have the prophets prophesying that it is over. But Manasseh's grandson is Josiah, an 8-year-old kid. He's a teenager. He starts to seek the Lord. Early 20s, he tells him to clean out the temple his granddad had trashed. And they find the law of God. They read it to this young king, and he rips his garments and repents. And he sends messengers to a prophetess in town named Huldah, the wife of the king's tailor. Right? It's a contemporary of Jeremiah, but he must have been out of town. But this woman had a reputation of hearing from God. And she tells the messengers, tell the man that sent you that judgment is coming. But not during his lifetime, because he repented when he heard the words of the Lord. And so for the rest of the 31-year reign of Josiah, there was peace and prosperity. He has this big Passover. They said it's the biggest one ever. And then he sends the Levites out to teach the law. And he tears down sodomite temples, right? And there's this 31-year period of a reprieve from the time that judgment was pronounced by the prophets, right, until he dies at the Battle of Carchemish. And then you have the son Jehoahaz for 3 months, and then the other son Jehoiakim for 11 years, and then another son Jehoiakim, and then Zedekiah for 11 years. And then they get taken captive to Babylon. But it's this idea that we've sinned, we deserve judgment. If we repent, God can put it off. And he's in control of time. That's why, in a sense, it's nobody's been able to pin down the date. Why? Because I think God's given himself a little room. If we repent, he'll put it off. If we don't repent, it can hit the fan really fast.
Do you think this was the pivotal moment for Trump when he got shot and the assassin missed the shot?
Yeah.
Maybe Trump, that was the moment when he acknowledged that was Jesus?
I do. I think so. I've talked to people who know the president, and they said it changed him. And I was actually at a meeting in North Carolina, and Eric Trump was sitting right in front of me. Right, I shook his hand and everything, and Trump was up there, almost twice as far away from me as you are on the platform speaking, and he said, "Yeah," and I looked at that,
nice chart,
that chart. Screen, that beautiful picture, and he goes, he says, "My son told me," he says, they like guns, they like to hunt. He says, "Dad, with that rifle and at that distance, a bad shooter would shoot you 100% of the time." And he says, "My sons have got more religious," and he's like nodding his head, and his sister's next to him, and he's like, yeah, and he says, "They really believe it was God." And he goes, I do think that God has a plan for me. He didn't get super religious about it, which in a sense is refreshing, because he's not like trying to play to a religious audience and say stuff but you could tell that he seriously took this attitude of, hey, I could have been dead. I'm going to get in as president, and I'm going to do what's best for America, no matter what.
Yeah, and I don't have to be reelected.
I don't care. I'm going to stand up and negotiate with other countries. I'm going to cancel this. And I mean, he has a boldness that can't be explained any other way. And I think, personally, it's like the world's last chance. Because if he were to be taken out, and the left would get back in and reinstate their globalist agenda, they would censor this broadcast.
I believe so.
They would use AI to censor all the stuff. They would somehow, like other countries who want to pressure Twitter and pressure them to censor, or you can't be in our country, right? I mean, they would fulfill their agenda. I think there would be some more crises. I think there would be more healthcare crisis, more all these just scare tactics, and they would send the message out. Everybody would panic, and then they would surrender their freedoms, and so I believe that's their end goal. The Bible says that that's part of the Book of Revelation, but it says that the Daniel's dream. Do you know Isaac Newton spent more time writing about the prophecies in the book of Daniel and Revelation than he wrote on science? Sir Isaac Newton, he spent more time studying these prophecies. And so the prophecy of Daniel, the statue, the head of gold, arms and chest of silver, abdomen of bronze, and then the legs of iron. And so he said, King Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold, the richest one. And then after you is going to become something a little inferior, but it's going to be two sides. So that's the Medo-Persian Empire. But it's going to be conquered by a lesser kingdom, but a stronger metal. And that's Alexander the Great, right? And the bronze weapons that they used. And then the Romans had iron weapons. And so there's the legs of iron, but it splits in two. Eastern Roman Empire, Western Roman Empire. And then the feet are iron and clay. And I am not a prophecy scholar, but I did read something that I thought was sort of interesting. It says that the feet of iron and clay, and it didn't mix. And I thought, okay, what is left over from this long period of time of the Roman Empire, East and West? And this article said radical Islam, of Muslim immigrants coming into Western nations that were part of the old Roman Empire, right? So Europe and England, and then by connection, America, drawing its heritage from there. But the fundamentalist Muslim immigrants coming in, and they're not assimilating. They're going into Germany, and they're not becoming Germans. They're going into France, they're not becoming French. They're going into England, they're not becoming English. They want to set up their own culture, their own community, their own Sharia laws, and it's breaking up the unity of these nations. And so if this statue, if this is the time period, and that's how, again, I'm not a scholar, so I'm not saying this for certain, but if it crumbles, the prophecy of Daniel says that this statue will crumble, and out of it will be a stone cut without hands. It's going to smash into it, and then that stone will turn into a mountain of the Lord. And then, then there's the end times, the glory of the Lord. So it's a idea that God is working through history. The goal is he created us for fellowship. There's plan A and plan B. He blesses us. We turn to him out of gratefulness. If we don't, he says he gives us over to our own devices. C.S. Lewis put it, said, there's two ways. I'm paraphrasing. I wrote a book called Believe, and I put the quote in there correctly. But it's God. There's the two ways: is Lord, thy will be done, or the Lord says, fine, have it your way. Right? And so we either surrender our will to God, or he's like, okay, I'm going to give you over to your own devices. He says he hides his faith. He says, fine. And then what happens? It's going to go south and turn bad, and then we're going to end up turning to the Lord out of desperation. On a theological thought, how many wills are there in heaven? Well, with one, it's God's will.
Yes.
Our Father who art in heaven, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's God's will being done in heaven. So in Isaiah, where Satan 5 times said, I will ascend to the mountain of the north. I will be above the throne of God. I will be like the most. 5 times Satan said, I will. It's like, wait a second, we got 2 wills going on. We got God's will and we got the devil's will, and they're not the same, so there's division. There's war, there's conflict, there's war in heaven, and the devil's cast out, because there can only be one will in heaven for there to be peace. The devil's cast out. He gets Adam to follow his will instead of God's will. And he begins to go in there tempting people to choose something other than God's will. So part of our life's journey is to get our will hammered out of us and surrender to God's will. Why? Because you're not going to take your will with you to heaven. Because if you did, there'd be 2 wills in heaven again, and there'd be war. And so the only one's going in is God's will. Even Jesus, sweat and drops of blood, and he says, Father, not my will, but thine be done. Mm-hmm. There can only be one will for there to be peace, and it's God, and it's a good will. He created you out of nothing, and he wants to love you for the rest of eternity.
Amen. Mm-hmm. Let's have 2 assumptions with you. Assumption number 1 is the President of the United States of America is the most powerful human being on planet Earth. Assumption number 2 is you become one. You become the President of the US. Once you do so, you have all those secret agencies like CIA, FBI, National Security, Secret Service, they come at you and they come to you and say, "Congratulations, Mr. President. We love you. We respect you. Now, as a president, you have the access to all the information that we have in the world, right? You ask us a question, we give you an honest answer. What would be your first question?" I know you've got lots of them, but the first one is the most important one to say.
I mean, to be honest, I probably wouldn't trust their answer.
Let's say that you're sure that you're going to get the truth. They're not going to lie to you.
Who controls the Federal Reserve? That makes money out of nothing. Who shot Kennedy? I think they released some information, but I think there's stuff that they haven't released.
We still didn't get the answer, right? Who did it, right?
Yeah. I think there were people inside of the government that were a part of it. Anyway, I don't know. That wouldn't be my first question.
Okay, so let's say they give you a list of names that control the Federal Reserve, right? Or they even control the whole America, the deep state. You get a list of, let's say, 10 last names. You as a president, would you expose it to the public?
Yeah. I mean,
not afraid of chaos? You think people can handle the truth?
Yeah. I would always. So, the King of England wanted to control the press. He passed what's called the Writs of Assistance, which gave him authority to arrest anybody on any suspicion and confiscate their property. And read everybody's correspondence. Open your letters and read it. And that was one of the things that caused the Americans to want to rebel against the Writs of Assistance. And John Adams was there. It's Quincy. Forgot his first name. I've been speaking all day, but anyway, they would quarter in your house. There were no British barracks in America, and the British soldiers would show up at your house and eat your food, sleep in your bed, and you'd have to sleep in the attic, right? I mean, they were doing all this stuff, and but it was concentrated power in the hands. One of the big issues during the pre-revolution was the king insisted on paying the judges. And we're like, oh, fine, who cares who pays them? It's like, no. The founders understood that your loyalty goes with your paycheck. And once the king started paying the judges paychecks, if you were a patriot and you went before that, you wouldn't get justice. And so the founder said, you know what? The King of England's the most powerful guy in the world. We experienced what it's like under concentrated power of somebody that thinks he's doing what's right, and we don't like it. Let's trust the people. Let's take the Tower of Babel and scatter it. Let's take the power of one person ruling top down through fear, and let's trust the people. The people may make mistakes, but let's trust the many rather than the few. A jury was a very important invention or thing that they instituted. So instead of a king-appointed judge deciding your fate, you have a jury of 12 of your peers. And all you need is one to disagree, and you're off the hook. This was a security. It was trusting the many rather than the few. Throughout world history, it's always trusted the few. Trust these elites. They know a little bit more. They're better. It's like, no, let's trust the people. There's even a difference between Catholics and Protestants. Now, spiritually, God can use any denomination. Jesus can reveal himself to anybody in any denomination. But as far as the impact on a culture, you look at a study was done by a guy named Robert Woodbury, Baylor University, and he studied the countries that Protestant and Catholic missionaries went to in the 1800s all around the world. And then he studied those countries today to see which ones are more prosperous and which ones are not. And he found out the countries that the Protestants went to, they taught everybody how to read so they could read the Bible. And it produced a literate populace. And in the Bible, they would read, the lazy man turns on his bed like a door on his hinges, and the one wicked servant buried his talent while the other ones went out there and did something with. And so it produced a thought, well, hey, I'm going to do something with my life. And it caused upward mobility, and those countries became more prosperous today. And the countries where the Catholic missionaries went to, they educated the upper class, the ruling elites, and the common people went from being illiterate going to a pagan temple to illiterate going to a cathedral. And today those countries are poorer with less freedom and less opportunity. And it's still a controlled top-down. So, I mean, you look at San Diego and Tijuana. I mean, there's just the same, it's just one border, but it's the same beach, the same ocean, the same land, the same air, the same ethnicity for all practical purposes, right? And largely. But one side is crime-ridden, and the other side is very, very prosperous. What's the difference? It has to be something other than, race or, whether air or water. It's an intangible. It's a thought. And it goes back to what I believe is a biblical teaching and of everybody being taught the Bible. You look at Europe, and it was all kings. And then the printing press was invented, 1454, Gutenberg. And then Martin Luther translates the Bible into German. They quickly rush it, and it's printed, and it goes everywhere. And now for the first time, the common people can read the Bible for themselves. And prior to Gutenberg, every Bible on planet Earth was hand copied. But now everybody could have it. And so what did the pastors do? The pastors transitioned from being the intermediary between these ignorant people that can't read, and the priests were the educated ones that could read the Bible in Latin, and they would tell the people, they would be the intermediary between God and the people, and they would be able to take the Bible teaching out of the holy language of Latin and explain it to the people, but they were the intermediary. But once everybody could have their own copy of the Bible, pastors began to say, okay, let me help you to read through the Bible. You get in the habit of reading through it yourself. And the biblical literacy of the congregation would rise, and it formed a congregational form of church government. And then when the Pilgrims came to America, they took it and they made it their government, their civil government. They took this bottom up. There's 6 stages. And historically, and I know I've been talking all over the map, but this is sort of interesting. I put a book together called Silence Equals Consent, The Sin of Omission. You can get it on Amazon. But the first stage is kings ruled over the government and ruled over the belief, the church. Nebuchadnezzar, he's over the Babylonian government, and he's over their beliefs. You bow to my statue, right? The kings, King Henry, he's over the king. And 1535 had the oath of supremacy, where you had to acknowledge the king as the head of the church. And if not, you're a criminal. And you get canceled and you get fired. So the king was over both. But but then you have a transition period where the popes pulled the church out from underneath the king. It was about a 1,000-year process where the popes would say, no, king, you're not going to have authority over the church. Right? A lot of Protestants criticized the pope, but this was a big step. Now, the kings didn't like that, and they would always insist that they wanted to appoint the bishops. And the popes would always threaten to excommunicate the king if they did. But it was pulling away of church government was now separate from civil government. Then the Reformation comes along and flips and begins this process of a bottom-up church government versus a top-down church government. And when the Pilgrims come to America, instead of landing in Virginia and submitting to the king's government, they're blown off course to Massachusetts. And the captain says it's too stormy and dangerous to sail anymore. Get off. And they go, we don't have a government. They take their covenant congregational church government and they make it their civil government. their Mayflower Compact, we, in the presence of God, covenant ourselves into a civil body politic. It's a polarity change in the flow of power in the womb of the Mayflower, the ship. It's just 102 people. We're all going to agree, and we're going to submit to what we agree upon. A covenant form of government under God. And that flipped the government from the top-down king to a bottom-up we the people. So you go from king being over both, king is now split, the pope's over one, the king's over the other, and then the church flips from a top-down pope to a bottom-up congregation, and then the congregational church government becomes the congregation civil government bottom-up. But then you have a movement, it's called the Second Great Awakening Revival, in the 1700s. It's great because it emphasized you having a personal experience with Jesus. But to some, it was so personal, it was only personal. And they said, when you have this experience with Jesus, your life will change. You should not do worldly things you used to do, bars and brothels and government. It's like, what was that last thing? Yeah, government, it's worldly. If you're really a Christian, you will withdraw from worldly government. Well, gee, if all the spiritual people withdraw from government, who's left to be involved but the less spiritual? And because they're less spiritual, they're going to yield to their ambitions. And they're not going to be content with ruling bottom up. They're going to want to get power hungry and rule the government top down. And they're not going to be content with ruling the government top down. They are going to be tempted to want to rule the church top down and say, we're going to tell you when you can have church, when you're going to shut your church down, when you got to be social distance, what you can say and what you cannot say. We're going to limit, right? And they can't help it. They're going to want to silence the church because they don't want anybody competing with them. And we're back where we started, with the government being over both.
Mr. Federer, these 3 hours were one of the most interesting 3 hours, I want to say, in decades. I loved it. God bless you. I believe the audience is going to love it as well. All the links to your books are going to be in the description. So guys and gals, please buy the books. And the last one was written last year, right? 2024?
We just finished a new one. It's called Courageous Christianity. The subtitle is How the 19th Century Religious Revival gave birth to YMCA athletics and a missionary movement to save the world. So you had a Second Great Awakening with Charles Finney in America, tent revivals all across. Charles Finney, his lectures, basically he preached the law so people could see their need for the Lamb. It's a whole, so in the book of James it calls the law a mirror. Mm-hmm. And so in the bathroom you have a mirror and you have soap in the water. The mirror shows you how dirty your face is, but it has no power to cleanse your face. Mm-hmm. But it serves a purpose. It creates the desire in you to use the soap in the water. So Adam and Eve sinned, and you got Noah and the flood, and by that time, people didn't even know they were sinners anymore. And so God gave them the law, so they said, oh, you think you're pretty good? Yeah, I'm pretty good. I'm certainly not as bad as that guy. So try to keep this for a while. Right? And it says it can't steal, can't lie, can't commit adultery. And Jesus comes along and ups it one and says, even if you think a lustful thought, you've committed adultery. Even if you say, you fool, you're on the verge of murder, right? And so, and one last thing, it's one strike and you're out. All you have to do is sin one time in your entire life and you can never go to heaven by being good enough.
Unless...
Well, so what happens is you realize, man, I need help. Okay, now I got your attention. You've looked in the mirror. You've seen the dirt on your face. Here's the soap and the water, the blood of Jesus to cleanse you of your sin. Thank God for the blood of Jesus, right? And so it's the preaching of the law that causes people to see their need for the Lamb. If you don't preach the law, say, oh, God loves you. It's like, big deal. God loves me. It's like, no, God's just. He has to judge every sin. It's one strike and you're out. It's like, oh, man, I need help. Okay, now God loves you. And Jesus died on the cross of papers. Thank you, Jesus. So Charles Finney preached the law and he preached the Lamb. And there's this revival with somebody in England named George Williams. He's 23 years old. He's a draper selling drapes and upholstery. And he said the young salesman would go to the taverns and drink and pick up girls and go to brothels. And he's a Christian now. He heard Charles Finney preach, and he said, I don't want to just go to the... And so he said, let's have a place where guys can get together for a Bible study and exercise. and he created the YMCA. And then ended up going national, and it ended up being the cause of lots of revivals. And anyway, that's the last book that my son and I put together. It's available on our website and Amazon.com, but it's called Courageous Christianity.
Link in the description. God bless you.